Story 1.
After discovering my wife's cheating, I exposed her, got my revenge, and left her life forever. The alarm sounded at its usual time, 6 a.m., and my wife Anita and I rose to begin our day. As I sat up on the edge of the bed and swung my feet to the floor, an audible groan escaped me. "What's the matter?" "You sound like an old man," she teased on her way to the bathroom. Feeling like an old man after the events of the previous night, I heard her laughter echoing from the bathroom as I reminisced about our passionate lovemaking. The evening had concluded with a particularly sensual act. Today marked the beginning of her week-long business trip, leaving me alone at home, a prospect I wasn't eagerly anticipating. The sound of the shower running tempted me to join her, but the memories of the previous night's exertions convinced me otherwise. When she returned to the bedroom, her mood was upbeat, contrasting with my self-pitying state. She encouraged me to rise and start the day, saying, "Come on, old man, get up and get going. We need 2 breadwinners to pay the mortgage on this place." With a nod, I replied, "All right, I'm moving," and stumbled into the bathroom to begin my morning routine. Later, we gathered downstairs for breakfast before she departed for the airport, and I made my way to work. Anita, an attorney, and I both worked at a medium-sized manufacturing plant in St. Louis. She specialized in negotiations and traveled with teams off-plant. This trip involved negotiating a new subcontract with a major aerospace firm in Denver. She traveled several times a year for similar negotiations, typically gone at least a week each time. At 35, she had graduated cum laude from the State University 12 years ago, standing at 5 feet 4 inches and weighing 125 lb, with measurements of 34, 24, 35. I'm Jack Fillmore, 37, working as an engineer in the same company as my wife. Standing at 6 feet 1 inch and weighing 165 lb, I work out to stay in shape. We both enjoyed playing golf and often formed a foursome with friends. We met at a company picnic, and it was love at first sight for me. It seemed the same for her, as after a whirlwind courtship, we got married 6 months later. We've been married for 7 years now, and just bought the house we're living in 3 months ago. It was the home where we planned to start our family, and Anita was going off her birth control pills upon her return from this trip. We were thrilled about having a family, and she intended to be a stay-at-home mom until the kids started school. Our parents, living in the area, were also anticipating our family expansion. After breakfast, I loaded Anita's travel bag into her car and gave her a goodbye kiss. Tears welled up in her eyes as she got into her car to leave. I expressed my hope that soon I wouldn't be traveling so we wouldn't have to go through these goodbyes. She shared her dislike for goodbyes, and I reassured her that I felt the same way. I mentioned that I would see her on Friday evening and that we could have takeout so she could rest. She agreed, saying, "Sounds good." "Bye," I observed, as she backed out of the garage and into the street, waving as she left. I trudged into the house to complete my preparations for leaving for the office. Arriving at the workplace, I ascended to the engineering department, grabbed a cup of coffee from the break room, and headed to my desk. Barely settling in, my phone rang. I identified myself to the caller as Fillmore. My boss, Evan, asked me to come into his office. I agreed, picked up my coffee, and made my way to his office. Evan mentioned that he recalled me saying last Friday that Anita would be traveling this week. He then presented an opportunity. Gil Hawkins, our field service engineer in California, was sick and unable to handle a problem a customer in San Jose was having with one of our models. Given my experience with that model, Evan asked if I would like to head out to San Jose and check it out. I agreed, stating that there wasn't much happening at the office and that I was batching it this week. Evan instructed me to get Kathy to arrange my reservations and tickets, and to call the customer to let them know I was coming and find out the problem. Feeling more enthusiastic about life, I stopped by Evan's secretary Kathy's desk and informed her about my flight and reservation needs. Later, I called the customer from my desk to understand their problem before heading home to pack. On the way home, a plan formed in my mind. If I finished quickly, I could surprise my wife with a stop in Denver on my way home. The thought of spending a couple of days with her in Denver was becoming increasingly exciting. While waiting for my flight at the airport, I attempted to call Anita's cell phone, but she didn't answer. So I left a voicemail indicating I'd be staying at my folks for a couple of days and to reach me on my cell during the evenings. Everything worked out fine. I was at the customer's location Tuesday morning, made the necessary equipment adjustments, and had it checked out and running satisfactorily by the afternoon. Returning to my hotel, I called the airline and secured a flight that would get me to Denver at p.m. Mountain Time. Checking out of the hotel in San Jose, I headed to the airport in San Francisco, where I had dinner. While eating, Anita called me on my cell, and we chatted for a few minutes. She inquired about my folks, and I responded as though I were at their house. She mentioned that negotiations were progressing, but she was tired and planned a quiet evening in her hotel room. We bid our goodbyes with expressions of love, and after eating, I boarded my PM flight. I checked in at the desk at Anita's suite hotel, and after verifying my identity, they provided me with a card for entry to her suite. Entering her suite quietly, I noticed a lamp illuminating the computer table, and her laptop was on. It closed. However, there was no sign of Anita. I placed my suitcase down and checked the bedroom and bathroom, finding them empty. I thought to myself that she probably hadn't returned to her room yet. I decided to sit down and wait, or perhaps go down and check the lounge to see if she was there. I then observed that the door to the adjacent room was slightly open. Approaching it, the door swung open silently on well-lubricated hinges. Surveying the living room and the adjoining suite, I found no one. Perplexed, I entered the room and heard a groan emanating from the bedroom. My gut tightened, and I broke into a sweat as I quietly approached the bedroom door. Although my heart may not have ceased, my breath certainly did. Witnessing the scene in the dimly lit room, Anita was unclothed, facing me, engaged with a man whose face remained unseen. My initial urge was to burst in, confront her, and confront the man, but reason prevailed over my emotions. Slowly backing away from the door, I returned to her suite, retrieving the digital camera from my travel bag brought along for souvenir pictures. I returned to the other bedroom door, turning off the flash and adjusting the camera for dim light photos. I calmly captured several images of the bed scene without their awareness. They were so engrossed in their activities that their eyes remained closed, oblivious to their surroundings. Before heading back to her suite, I examined an open briefcase on the table, finding a business card with the name Sam Harris, the chief negotiator for our company. I pocketed the card. Back in her suite, I utilized a camera-computer interface cable I had with me to connect the camera to her laptop. Since our laptops had the same photo program, I easily downloaded a picture from my camera and set it as her desktop background. I then packed my camera into my travel bag and left her suite quietly. Before departing, I heard her cry out in climax. I nearly broke down right there, but pressed on towards the elevator. After returning the entry card to the desk, I contacted the airline to inquire about the next flight back to St. Louis. Luckily, a 6:30 a.m. flight was available, promising a 9:30 a.m. arrival home. With some luck, I calculated this would coincide with the time Anita would be opening her laptop at the negotiating table. She would then realize she had been caught, signaling the end of our marriage. Returning to the airport, I checked into a nearby motel where sleep eluded me. I kept replaying the distressing scene from her hotel bedroom. I wept, allowing my pain to manifest in tears. By the time I left the motel at a.m., I had exhausted my tears, resolved to conclude our marriage swiftly. Upon arriving in St. Louis, my cell phone began to ring as I entered my car, and checking the caller, I saw it was Anita. I turned it off and headed home. Upon entering the house, the phone was ringing, but checking the caller ID revealed it was Anita again. Letting it go to the answering machine, I heard her sobbing on the phone. She pleaded with me to call her right away, expressing that she needed to talk with me and that it was important. I ignored her tearful plea, changed my clothes, rented a U-Haul, and returned home to start packing. If my calculations were correct, she would arrive around 4 p.m., and I aimed to be out of the house by then. It took a couple of hours, but I successfully moved all my personal belongings to a rental storage unit. Before packing, I contacted our lawyer and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. After unloading my belongings at the storage unit, I met with our lawyer and requested the initiation of divorce proceedings. While tempted to cite infidelity as the cause, I opted for incompatibility, reserving the infidelity accusation in case she contested the divorce. I also requested him to draft a new will, designating my brother as a beneficiary. Making a stop at the bank, I moved half of our savings and checking balance to new accounts solely in my name. Subsequently, I contacted my investment advisor to perform a similar transfer for our accounts with him. With a heavy heart, I drove to my parents' house, carrying my suitcase with me. I entered through the open door, and my mother, spotting me first, exclaimed loudly, "Jack! Where have you been? Anita has been calling here several times looking for you. Did you inform her that you were staying here?" My retired father joined us, and I sat down to explain everything to them. They were astonished when I revealed Anita's infidelity and the end of our marriage. I inquired if I could stay with them for a few days until I found a furnished apartment, and they agreed. My calculations seemed fairly accurate because around 6 p.m., as we were sitting down to eat, the doorbell rang. My dad answered it, and a moment later he returned with Anita, looking visibly distressed. She questioned why I hadn't answered her calls, expressing the need to talk. She noted that I had moved all my stuff out of the house and assumed the message left on my desktop would provide the necessary information. I responded, expressing my relief that it was her and suggesting that we go somewhere to talk, I firmly stated that I was no longer her sweetheart and had nothing to discuss. Divorce proceedings had already begun, and anything that needed to be conveyed could go through our lawyers. I explained that what I witnessed in Denver had destroyed any feelings I had for her and requested her to leave so I could finish my dinner. She pleaded, and I reiterated that there was nothing to talk about. Without addressing the infidelity directly, I mentioned having pictures and that I planned to confront her lover Sam the following day. She tearfully insisted on talking. I responded, suggesting that she leave as my dinner was getting cold. I proposed that she write me a letter, articulating how she could rationalize breaking her wedding vows. I assumed that, as a smart lawyer, she could explain how it was all my fault and that she could still love and respect me very much. With a sob, she turned away. Before reaching the door, she turned back and pleaded again. I said goodbye, and after she left, still crying, my parents remained stunned. My mom commented on the harshness of my response. I retorted, sharing the harsh reality of her actions and my inability to trust her again. I questioned whether she wanted me to give her grandchildren from a woman like that. My dad suggested that with time my perspective might change. I replied, expressing doubt and suggesting we talk about something else so I could digest my food. That Monday morning when I left home, I was feeling sorry for myself, having to leave Jack. But I thought how wonderful it would be when I got back and we could start our family. We'd waited this long to make sure we were set financially and career-wise to begin being parents. Now everything was almost in place. The journey to Denver was uneventful. I sat next to Sam Harris, our chief negotiator, and we briefly discussed the upcoming negotiations and our families. Sam, who had been married for 20 years with 2 high school-aged children, knew that I planned to quit work upon pregnancy, and he expressed that he would miss me. Sam and I, a negotiating team since before my marriage, had a comfortable rapport. The other 2 team members conversed behind us. Upon reaching the Denver hotel, we checked into our rooms, with Sam and I opting for adjoining rooms as usual. Originally intended for late-night strategy sessions, this arrangement evolved about years ago when our relationship took a physical turn. We convinced ourselves that it was a stress relief mechanism after challenging negotiations, and at the time, we considered it not cheating on his wife if it contributed to our professional collaboration. After Jack and I got married, I refrained for a couple of years due to guilt. However, during an especially demanding negotiation, Sam proposed resuming our arrangement to relieve stress, and I reluctantly agreed. It became a habit again, with the thrill of secrecy boosting my libido at home, benefiting Jack and lessening my guilt. On the first night of this trip, we didn't meet as I felt tired after dinner. However, after the initial day of negotiations, I agreed to meet him the following night. The next morning, upon opening my laptop, I was shocked by what I saw on the screen. Sam, sitting next to me, quickly closed the lid and we took the laptop to the hallway. He was furious, demanding to know what kind of content I had on my desktop. I responded that I didn't know and explained that it wasn't there the last time I used it. Still in shock, I suggested checking it again. Upon reopening it, we both looked at the picture and Sam exclaimed that it was me. I questioned how it could be me, but he insisted, adding that it was probably him under me, although my face couldn't be seen. I asked if he had left the laptop unattended at any point the previous day. He denied it, saying that it was with him during the trip and in his suite while he was in mine. I wondered if anyone could have accessed my room with a camera, but he didn't think so, stating that the door was closed and he assumed it was locked. I advised him to get back to the hotel and check if anyone had been given access to his room the previous night. I assured him that I would handle things on my end and asked him to reach Jack to find out where he was last night. He expressed doubt, saying it couldn't have been Jack, as he spoke with him at his folks' place. I asked if he had called Jack on his parents' phone, to which he replied that Jack had asked him to call on his cell phone. Worried about the situation, I mentioned that I didn't like the sound of it, as Jack could have been anywhere during their conversation. I instructed him to call me on my cell if he found out anything, and urged him to do whatever he could to manage the fallout from this. I told him to take a cab back to the hotel and said goodbye. Feeling anxious, I considered the possibility that Jack had taken the picture and placed it on my laptop. It seemed like a message that our marriage was over. I needed to return to the hotel to gather information. The receptionist arranged a cab, and 15 minutes later I was back, checking the front desk to see if anyone accessed my suite. The clerk confirmed that a Mr. Jack Fillmore received a card at 9:45 the previous evening and returned half an hour later. At that moment, I knew my marriage was likely over. The man I loved more than anything had disappeared. Despite the heartbreak, I felt compelled to fight for him. Entering my suite, I immediately tried to reach him on his cell and at work. No answer on his cellet had been turned off. Leaving an important voice message, I called him back. Soon his work secretary informed me he was on a business trip to California, expected back tomorrow. That was it. He had gone to California and stopped on his way back to surprise me. I guess we were both surprised. Calling his folks, they hadn't seen him for several days. I asked them to have him call me. No answer at home, but I left a message there too. Alone in the suite, I cried, realizing I had no way to talk to him unless I went home. So I picked up the phone, made reservations for the next flight to St. Louis, and after packing, I informed Sam of the situation. He was quiet before speaking. Sam mentioned that it seemed we were both facing divorce, or worse. He pointed out the company's policy against managerial employees fraternizing, highlighting the potential risk of both of us being fired, which would not look good on our records. He expressed concern about losing Jack and acknowledged that losing his family would be bad too. He advised me to get back to St. Louis and find Jack, urging me to see if he would listen to reason. He informed me that he had made reservations for a flight leaving at noon, scheduled to be back by 4:30. For his sake, he emphasized the importance of finding Jack and talking to him. Sam mentioned that he would let me know how it goes and explained that he had to stay there until negotiations were finished. He assured me that he would be waiting to hear from me. We said our goodbyes. Picking up my bag and laptop, I hurried down to the lobby, checked out, and took the hotel limo to the airport. Praying all the way back to St. Louis, I hoped to get Jack to talk to me. I had to explain it was just closeness and did not affect him at all. I had to stake everything on the hope that he could be unemotional about my infidelity and accept it for what it was, nothing but meaningless closeness. Arriving back home, nothing seemed out of place at first. However, entering our bedroom and finding all his belongings gone made me realize he knew and had left me. I had to find him. After many fruitless phone calls, I decided to go to his folks' house to see if he was there or if they had an idea where he was. He was at his folks', and the reception I received from him made me nauseous in its unfeeling brutality. He informed me he was in the process of filing for divorce, had no desire to talk, and nothing I could say would change his mind. After sarcastically suggesting I write a long letter explaining my position, I left and sat in my car crying. The family we had planned would never happen. Growing old together and enjoying grandchildren together felt like an unattainable dream. From a selfish viewpoint, what grieved me even more was the thought that by the time I found another husband, I might be too old to conceive. Eventually, I started the car and returned to our vacant house. Following a restless night haunted by visions of Anita and Sam together, I rose early and descended to my folks' home, brewing coffee. Retrieving my laptop and camera, I proceeded to download the camera pictures into the computer, aiming to identify Sam. Examining the pictures, Sam's face remained unclear, however. I noticed something on his right arm reaching towards Anita's chest. Upon closer inspection, I identified a tattoo, a heart with the word Marie on it. Sam's wife was Marie. That's all I needed. I returned upstairs, showered, and prepared for work. When I came back down, my mother was up preparing breakfast. Later, at work, I burned a couple of CDs with the pictures I had taken and a blow-up of Sam's tattoo. I printed several sets and organized them in a folder before walking to our human resources department. I requested to see the manager, Phil, whom I knew from golf outings. Placing a set of pictures in front of him, I explained that the images might appear inappropriate, but they depicted my wife and Sam Harris. The date and time on them confirmed they were taken Tuesday evening in Sam's hotel suite in Denver during a company negotiation trip. Phil seemed visibly shocked and inquired about what he could do. I responded, suggesting that he could terminate both of them for cause under the anti-fraternization clause in their contract with the company. I pointed out that this clause had never been enforced before and questioned whether he was sure about pursuing this course of action. I mentioned that it would bring the affair out in the open and assumed that he was considering divorcing Anita over the matter. I informed him that I already had my lawyer drawing up the papers, but if he chose not to pursue it, I would bring suit against the company. Phil agreed, stating that he would take the matter to the legal department and get the ball rolling. He then prompted me to continue with the next point of discussion. I went in to see my boss, Evan, to inform him about the situation. He was appropriately horrified at what I had to tell him about my wife and Sam Harris. When I requested the rest of the week off as vacation time, he readily agreed. In parting, he congratulated me on a job well done during my trip to California. The customer praised the quick resolution of their problem and requested if I would consider taking over the California territory. Given the current field engineer's retirement due to ill health, I mentioned that I'd consider it and provide an answer upon my return to work the following week. On my way out of Evan's office, Kathy, his secretary, informed me that my wife had been looking for me and would return later. I instructed Kathy not to let my wife see me under any circumstances and expressed that there was a significant problem, as we were getting divorced and she and Sam Harris were involved. I anticipated the news spreading throughout the plant by noon, considering Kathy's inclination for gossip. Returning to my desk, I called Marie Harris, Sam's wife, whom I knew from company picnics. I was aware that my revelations about our spouses could be challenging for her. I contacted Marie and explained the situation, expressing the need to talk as soon as possible. She agreed to meet and provided her address, and I agreed to visit her in 15 minutes. Upon arriving at the Harrises, I felt a sense of dread about disclosing the situation to Marie and her family. However, I believed Sam should face consequences, and Anita should not bear the entire fallout. Marie greeted me, offering coffee, which I accepted. I decided to get straight to the point. I disclosed the affair between Sam and Anita, my pursuit of a divorce from Anita, and my decision to have them both fired from their jobs. I mentioned that the information would soon become public knowledge and offered to show her photos as evidence. Observing her face, I was surprised at the lack of a significant reaction. Marie shared that she had suspected Sam's infidelity during company trips for years but hoped it wasn't true. She acknowledged Sam's previous role as a loving husband and father. Marie expressed regret for both my marriage and her own situation. She considered the possibility of Sam being fired and the challenges he might face finding another well-paying job. She concluded by offering me a set of photographs if I wanted them. Marie expressed gratitude for sharing the photographs, stating that she would leave them for her to look at later when she could gather the strength. I apologized, explaining that I couldn't let the situation go, especially considering Anita and I were on the verge of starting a family. I emphasized the importance of trust and respect in a relationship, qualities I believe the mother of our children should possess. She acknowledged my decision and thanked me for informing her directly, expressing understanding about not wanting to hear it from other sources first. Marie extended her sympathy for my situation with Anita, anticipating her devastation and remorse when she found out about the affair. She wished it were a one-time incident, finding it easier to forgive, but believed it had been ongoing for years, making it harder to accept. Now that it was out in the open, Marie emphasized her pride and the need to hold her head up. I assured her that if there was anything I needed, I would let her know before leaving and heading back to my parents' house. Update. It's been 6 months since I initiated divorce proceedings. I received my copy of the agreement dissolving my marriage to Anita this morning. I never talked with her or saw her again after the time she came to my parents' house. My lawyer handled it all. I gave her the heavily mortgaged house with the highly financed furniture and furnishings to release all claims on me. I also had my name taken off the mortgage. She assumed full responsibility for making the payments. Of course, without a job, she had to put it up for sale and lost her shirt on the deal. She attempted to contest the divorce. But I threatened to change the reason for divorce to infidelity and release the pictures of her and Sam to the internet if she didn't sign the papers in 48 hours. She signed them within the required time, and that is why I'm a free man today. I guess she decided that she didn't want me that bad anyway. She was terminated from her job, but she's a smart lawyer and negotiator, so she found another one within a month. Not making as much, or with the benefits seniority brought her in her old job, but I hear she's getting by and dating again. Lots of luck to the boyfriend if she lands him. I wonder if she's told him about our divorce and the reason. Maybe I should enlighten him. Marie divorced Sam and took him to the cleaners financially. He found another job too after he was terminated. But he's struggling to make the alimony and child support payments with his new salary. I'm now living in Santa Maria, California, a quiet Louisiana near the coast, about halfway between the Bay Area and LA. This positions me pretty well to cover both southern and northern parts of the state. I moved here about 4 months back and have an apartment in a complex with other singles and young couples, most trying to save money for a down payment on a house. Housing costs are high out here, and it takes big bucks to buy into the market. I have a steady girlfriend who lives in the same complex. She's divorced like me, but we're comfortable together, and I think we'll see how it goes in the future. With me traveling so much, I really need to trust the one I marry. But I need to make a move before too long if we want to start a family. Biological clocks keep on ticking.
Story 2.
I had just arrived home on Friday and was eagerly anticipating the weekend. My wife greeted me differently, not with her usual smile and peck, but appearing fidgety and determined about something. It seemed like something was off. I greeted her and inquired about the kids, expressing that it was Friday and they should be home. She informed me that the kids were with Mom until Monday and expressed an urgency in her voice, saying she needed to talk to me. She mentioned having something to tell me, acknowledging that it might be tough for me to grasp. She assured me it wasn't something negative, but might be challenging to understand initially. She asked me to try to understand if I loved her. I agreed to try to understand, and she thanked me, stating that it was something that had been on her mind for a long time and might sound silly or strange at first. She then revealed her desire to be fornicatory with others, and despite my initial laughter, she conveyed seriousness. I questioned if she was divorcing me, but she reassured me that she loved me and would never leave me. She emphasized that this was something she felt she needed to do. As she explained her desire to explore beyond our marriage, anger replaced my initial shock. I expressed my lack of understanding and disagreement with such a decision. She insisted that she was going to do it whether I liked it or not, clarifying that she had never cheated on me and had no intention of doing so. She assured me that she had promised to take precautions and not deny me anything in our bed. However, I wasn't fully present in the conversation, and she noticed my mind was wandering. She emphasized that this had nothing to do with us and made it clear that it was a personal need she felt compelled to fulfill. Despite her pause, I remained motionless and unresponsive. I just sat there staring, appearing to be all but catatonic. My wife of 17 years had just destroyed me and expected me to actually like it, or at least tolerate it. I didn't, and I wouldn't, not ever. Veronica, my wife, expressed her need for this change, explaining that she was getting to a stage in life where she really needed it. She shared her history of being a maiden when we married, and how she had never known another man. She emphasized her desire to explore and understand lovemaking, clarifying that it was only about the physical aspect, not love, except with me. I continued to stare, unable to say anything. The revelation that my wife wanted to explore other men, not just one but multiple, was deeply unsettling. The most shocking part was that she expected me to be okay with it. Veronica urged me to say something, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I rose and headed upstairs to the bedroom, the one that had been ours. Now it meant nothing to me. I felt sick and broken spiritually, my body devoid of sensation. I was overwhelmed with fear. In a remarkably short time, perhaps 15 minutes or less, she had managed to destroy our marriage. I sat on the bed contemplating, or rather, attempting to contemplate. I knew I had to leave the house and distance myself from my wife, a wife who was on the brink of betraying me, and she was determined to proceed, regardless of my feelings. I had been an avid marathon runner in college. Running or taking long walks always helped me clear my thoughts. I decided to walk for a long distance. I changed out of my suit and into comfortable jeans, a Henley shirt, and my $200 running shoes. Grabbing my wallet, a cap, and sunglasses, I descended the stairs. Veronica remained seated in the same spot where she had disclosed her intentions to explore closeness encounters with other men. I paused for a moment, gazing at her. Once again, she felt like a stranger to me. Glancing back at her, my hand on the doorknob, I asked who she was. I turned and exited, slamming the door shut behind me. As I briskly moved forward, her words were drowned out as I shut the door forcefully. I was already past the neighbor's house when she called for me to return and talk. She caught up, running alongside me until she ran out of breath. She continued to plead, expressing that we needed to talk, and she loved me. She assured me that she wasn't doing this to hurt me and emphasized that there was still an us. She professed her love and pleaded for me to come back. She eventually gave up. I think she collapsed on the sidewalk, but I didn't glance back to confirm. I couldn't bear to look at her. She couldn't keep up with the pace I was setting. I could still complete a marathon in under 3 hours without breaking a sweat. Soon I was 2 blocks away, and she was nowhere in sight. Turning the corner, I accelerated, going into overdrive as I called it. I was cruising. I could maintain this pace indefinitely, and perhaps I would. We had met in college. She was distributing cups of water to participants in a 10K event. I had won that race. Later, I joked with her that I had won because I was racing to find her before she slipped away. I caught her just in time, before she disappeared into the crowd of spectators. We hit it off instantly. She worked as a secretary to the dean of the business school. Despite not finishing college, she had secured a significant job due to her meticulous attention to detail and adeptness with written communication. I was a graduate student at the time, studying electronics and computer science. We dated for 6 months before becoming fornicatory, and it was incredible. Despite being a maiden, She was exceptionally skilled in matters of closeness, and she thoroughly enjoyed it. At the time, it didn't occur to me, but she was naturally enthusiastic. There were signs. She just never fully embraced it. We married months after my graduation and 14 months after we first met. I was 26, and Ronnie was a year older at 27. Yes, I'll repeat it. She was still a maiden at 27. Callie and John Jr. arrived in the 9th and 10th years of our marriage, respectively, and we thrived. Ronnie continued as the dean's secretary, and I worked as a computer systems engineer for Peters Limited, a company involved in cutting-edge military research and development. My boss and the owner of Peters Limited was Bill Schuler, a 60-ish bachelor with an almost manic work ethic. Bill and I were not just boss and employee, we were close friends. Veronica and I had been married for about 17 years now, which I had believed to be wonderful. However, evidently, Veronica thought differently. Over the past few months, Ronnie had become somewhat distant, occasionally short-tempered with me, and less frequently with the children. This had led to a couple of heated arguments. While being short with me was one thing, I couldn't tolerate it when it came to the children. I considered that she might be going through menopause. I wasn't well versed in female biology, but I was aware of some things. I had intended to look into it more, but I never got around to it. Now, as I walked, I wished I had. Veronica explained to Roberta that she didn't know where Bobby, her brother, was. She mentioned that he had left the house around 5 p.m. on Friday and hadn't been seen since. Expressing her worry and frantic state, Veronica sought guidance from Roberta, expressing concern about Bobby's whereabouts and asking for help. Roberta Mason could have been my wife's twin, and they had more than once been mistaken for sisters. Both had flowing red hair, curvaceous figures, and adorable freckles. Roberta was maybe an inch taller than Ronnie at 5'7", but otherwise, they were near clones of each other. However, Bobby had a different personality. She was tough-minded, slow to speak, and less inclined to do so, still single at age 40. No, she wasn't gay, but she preferred being independent. Roberta Mason inquired about John, expressing surprise that he would behave in such a manner. Veronica shared that they had a disagreement, and John had walked out without talking. Bobby, concerned about the situation, reassured Veronica that Ronnie, presumably her husband, would find John. However, Bobby wanted to know the details of their argument, to which Veronica responded vaguely, stating it was personal and nothing that should have led John to leave. Roberta, a psychologist, commented on the situation, expressing her intention to find out more when they located John. She noted that Veronica had waited too long to call, hinting at sarcasm. Despite their good relationship, Roberta always felt that Veronica was a bit ditzy. Roberta then asked for details about John's departure, including the direction he headed, his clothing, and if he had taken a coat or his car. Veronica provided information about John going east toward Baxter, wearing a dark green t-shirt, jeans, and a Cubs baseball cap. She mentioned that he hadn't taken a coat or his car, expressing concern about the freezing weather. Roberta acknowledged the urgency of the situation and instructed Veronica to stay home and man the phone in case John called. She assured Veronica that she had her cell phone and would keep her informed as she set out to search for John. The road was icy, so Roberta Mason drove under the speed limit. 10 miles out of town, her cell rang, prompting her to pull over to answer it. She learned that John was in Baxter, and expressing concern, decided to head there immediately before hanging up. In Baxter, a town of 150 with few residents, John found himself indifferent to the place, enjoying a hot meal and warmth in his cell. The steel door at the end of the hall clanged open, and although John couldn't see who was coming, the footsteps signaled someone approaching. As the only prisoner, it had to be him. Upon arrival, Roberta questioned John, asking if he was proud of himself. He inquired if Veronica had called her, and Roberta confirmed, revealing that she had already been on the road looking for him. She expressed concern about his actions, pointing out that he had little ones and a worried wife at home. John sarcastically remarked that the kids might be worried, but Veronica wouldn't be. Roberta acknowledged that Veronica hadn't provided much detail, only mentioning a tiff and John leaving. John explained the disagreement, revealing Veronica's intention to be fornicatory with other men, whether he liked it or not. Roberta's face remained composed as John elaborated on Veronica's plans. The guard sympathetically opened John's cell door, and they walked toward the front receiving area. John was informed that he had been bailed out but needed to return by Friday to plead. The jailer advised him to pay the fine and settle the damages for the bar fight, which involved broken chairs, a damaged table, and a broken mirror. John agreed, acknowledging the logic of the advice. During the 2-hour-plus drive back, Roberta questioned John about the bar fight. After he shared his story, she remained silent for some time and then began her analysis. As John's sister, she considered herself his patient and insisted on helping him, noting that women go through changes men can't understand, attributing it to hormonal factors that can induce fear and insecurity. I conveyed to Bobby that I wasn't naive, emphasizing that other women don't engage with other men to improve their situations. I spoke with conviction, asserting my position. Bobby countered, sharing a statistic that 60% of men and 40% of women engage in extramarital affairs, contributing to the high divorce rate. She suggested that Veronica might be going through such a phase and needed my support. As I started to respond, she raised her hands to stop me. She clarified that she wasn't advocating for letting Veronica be fornicatory with other men. Instead, she urged me to talk to her, hold her hand, and guide her through this challenging period. Bobby emphasized that Veronica needed my strength and support. I expressed my willingness to do anything to help Veronica, with the condition that if she allowed another man to be fornicatory with her, our relationship would be over without any exceptions. I made it clear that if she disrespected me in that way, I would do my best to bring consequences to both her and her lover or lovers. Bobby fell silent again, and I felt uneasy, perceiving her thoughtfulness as judgment. The conversation then shifted to lighter topics. Observing my accomplishment of walking 100 miles in 2 days, Bobby acknowledged it. I downplayed it, saying it was something I could do and needed the time for introspection, dismissing it as nothing significant. It was a hell of a feat, especially given the temperatures and road conditions at this time of year. "What were you thinking?" she said. She meant, how could I not have thought about the conditions of the weather and the roads? But I extrapolated her words to mean my thoughts about Veronica, myself, and our marriage. Christmas was 3 weeks away, shaping up to be quite the holiday. What awaited me under the yet-to-be-put-up tree? Perhaps a used contraceptive, bearing someone else's seed. I felt furious, and couldn't bring myself to go home just yet. I instructed Bobby to drop me at Peter's, explaining that it was Sunday, and I needed to be alone for a while. I suggested that she could go there tomorrow and inform Veronica about my need for solitude. Bobby expressed her understanding and mentioned that she would talk to Veronica, who was quite worried about me. She speculated that Veronica might reconsider her plans, if any, now that she was aware of my feelings. I assured Bobby that I wouldn't do anything rash and just needed more time to think. After dropping me off, I watched Roberta drive away before entering my office. Although she believed Veronica might postpone her plans, I couldn't shake the concern that she might have already acted on them. Reflecting on the loss of trust in my wife, I considered it a significant and troubling situation. "He's afraid he's lost you," Roberta commented upon entering, shrugging off her coat without a greeting. Veronica dismissed the notion, stating that she had told me he would never lose her. Roberta challenged her, emphasizing that when she mentioned making love to other men, any man would be thinking what I was thinking. Veronica, looking troubled, asked if I had told Roberta. Roberta confirmed, stating that she was my sister and that secrets like that couldn't be kept for long. Veronica defended her desire to explore, framing it as something she had always wanted to know about and considered okay to do. Roberta issued a warning, stating that if Veronica went through with it, she would lose me, our children, and most of the friends and relatives who loved her. She emphasized the gravity of the situation, questioning if Veronica realized the consequences. Veronica couldn't meet Roberta's eyes as she explained her need, hoping that Roberta would understand. She revealed that it had consumed her for a long time, expressing uncertainty about being able to help herself. Veronica emphasized that John had always understood her and needed him to do so again. She acknowledged that she couldn't live without him, but was unsure if she could refrain from acting on her desires with someone else. Expressing the real danger of outright cheating, Veronica admitted that the overpowering feeling and need inside her were challenging to resist. Roberta, in response, shared her perspective, stating that she could relate to such overpowering feelings. She explained that despite loving men and not being gay, she chose not to marry because she knew she couldn't remain faithful to one man. She cautioned Veronica about the potential consequences of her proposal, emphasizing the risk of losing everything if she didn't clean up her act soon. Veronica conceded that Roberta might be right, and she started to sob. Roberta comforted her, assuring her that everything would be all right. She offered to stay with Veronica for the night and promised to be there the next day when John returned, ready to referee the situation. Roberta expressed gratitude for Veronica's acknowledgement and advised her to give up the idea of being with other men. She emphasized the importance of convincing her husband that he had nothing to fear, recognizing it as a challenging task. Veronica nodded, allowing herself a small smile, though Roberta missed the slight narrowing of her eyes in response to the last words. Realizing that obtaining her husband's approval was unrealistic, Veronica faced a decision: either abandon her plans entirely or persuade her husband otherwise. These were two distinct choices, but her priority was winning him back, as her love for him remained undeniably true. For the first time since his abrupt departure, Veronica felt a sense of clarity. Answers were within reach. She would soon find out. The following morning, I woke up on the office couch feeling a bit stiff. The lengthy walk and less than ideal sleeping conditions had taken a toll. While accustomed to marathon distances for time, military-style endurance walks were a rarity for me, especially in the last decade. Yet, I was somewhat proud that I hadn't lost my touch. Not yet. I parked in front of the house a little after 10 a.m., knowing Callie and John Jr. would be at school. Veronica opened the door, embracing me tightly. Her relief at my return was palpable. My wife expressed relief, assuring me that she was no longer worried and asking me to forget everything she had said earlier. She admitted to being an idiot and mentioned having a conversation with Bobby, who helped her understand. I remained cautious, my suspicion lingering, as she seemed to have abandoned something she adamantly refused to discuss just a few days prior. I acknowledged her statement with a guarded response, hoping she meant it. Entering the kitchen, I noticed Bobby sitting at the table, sipping her tea. I greeted her and questioned if she was there to support my wife's story. Bobby confirmed that they had talked extensively and expressed hope that we could get through the situation, describing it as a dumb female head trip. Despite the reassurances, something felt off, and I found myself in quite a predicament, lacking trust in my wife. I nodded, hesitant to take anything for granted despite Bobby's insight. She hadn't witnessed or heard Veronica like I had during the Friday confrontation. Over the next few days, Veronica worked hard to reassure me. I was almost starting to buy into Bobby's explanation of a dumb female head trip. Then came Thursday, a peculiar phone call with background noises. I didn't mention it to Veronica, but figured out the words: call, cell, call, my cell. Upstairs, I found her cell on the dresser, checked the call history, noted 6 unknown numbers, and felt lucky. With my military background, I knew uncovering the identities behind those numbers would be easy. Illegal, yes, but my boss had used his clearance for a similar situation. It had been a year. Now it was my turn. This wasn't a no-fault state. If I caught her with evidence, she was mine. Feeling confident that night, the lovemaking was more than good. She had certainly turned things around in the past 6 days. I hoped I wouldn't have to give it up anytime soon. Arriving early in the lab, I aimed to catch Tim before he headed into the field. Tim, our systems installer and field techie, shared a camaraderie with me, fueled by numerous brews as we cheered for our alma mater, Ohio State. I called out to Tim as he passed by, asking if he had a minute. He halted on his way out and agreed to come into my office when I mentioned having a problem and needing his help. In my office, Tim settled into a chair, and I took a seat beside him. I brought up the incident from last year when Mr. Peters had him do some snooping. Tim became suddenly attentive, expressing concern about my involvement in a similar matter. I explained that I had reasons to be concerned and asked if he could assist me. Tim agreed to help, but warned of the risks, emphasizing that I should be certain. I nodded and assured him that if I had anything, I would contact him, requesting that he not discuss it, even with me. He agreed, suggesting that I do some spot checking over the next month and then get back to him. I handed him some phone numbers pulled from my wife's cell, admitting that I didn't know them and that it might be nothing, but it could also be significant. Tim acknowledged that it was a good place to start and noted that it wasn't illegal if my name was on the account, which I confirmed. Reflecting on my wife's actions, I recognized that she had underestimated my tech savviness and connections in the field. If she intended to cheat, her chances of escaping were slim unless she could completely allay my suspicions. It seemed like a precarious strategy, but perhaps her only option. Life settled at home with content kids, a happy Veronica, and me feigning happiness. A week later, Tim asked for a meeting at our usual spot and disclosed that he had checked out the numbers, obtained addresses, and caught Veronica at 2 of them on successive days with pictures, film, and audio evidence. I was informed that my wife was definitely cheating on me, to which I responded nonchalantly, requesting more evidence, especially additional film, as I had plans to take her down along with her lovers. Tim expressed a concern, suggesting that Veronica might be running some kind of sting, but I assured him that I wouldn't be using the gathered evidence in court and had another purpose in mind. Tim, enjoying the espionage aspect, agreed to get more evidence. After 3 weeks, armed with extensive information about the individuals involved, I marveled at the depth of Tim's investigation. It was now a matter of choosing the right time and battleground. I needed to speak with Bobby, and together we watched the gathered evidence in her office. My sister expressed disbelief and irritation, acknowledging that Veronica had even fooled her. Reflecting on the situation, I shared my frustration about feeling deceived and getting sloppy seconds at times. Bobby advised against seeking revenge, emphasizing that it would only eat at me in the aftermath, and our kids would eventually make judgments about both of us. Despite mental torment, I acknowledged her wisdom and decided overt revenge against Veronica was off the table. However, I contemplated retaliating against her lovers, believing that if executed properly, it would make her incredibly unpopular in no time. As it turned out, she had 5 lovers, not 6. The additional number I obtained was a wrong dial to her cell. 4 of her liaisons were married, all with underage children. 2 were individuals whose careers I could significantly jeopardize with minimal effort. 1 a state politician, the other a priest. Veronica had ventured into deep trouble. The influence of a woman's closeness drive had undeniably corrupted her. My sister's choice to remain single for so long suddenly made sense. Veronica would have been better off doing the same. My primary concern was for the children of the cheaters, and of course, my own. Mine would stay with me. There would be no compromise. While Veronica would have open-ended visitation, no boyfriends would be allowed near them. Otherwise, I would grant her the house, but claim everything else, relocating myself and the children to a lovely 3-bedroom condo near their new elementary school. It was time for war. A tech-savvy friend blurred my wife's face in 5 damning videos and crafted copies for the wives and significant others of the 5 individuals. 2 additional copies were sent to a carefully chosen TV station to expose the priest. I contemplated suing the culprits, but that would have left Veronica vulnerable in court, and I needed to safeguard her to some extent for the sake of my children. I was partially heeding Bobby's advice. The thought occurred to me that technology might eventually put an end to extramarital affairs. It was becoming too easy to expose these individuals. On D-Day, I went to work early, staring at my computer, set up and ready. 1 double click, and 4 husbands would likely become ex-husbands, while another would find himself singing hymns in a remote monastery. I double-clicked. Hell would soon break loose. I smiled, feeling like Joshua at the walls of Jericho, anticipating the walls tumbling down. I informed my section boss that I was taking the rest of the day off and went home. I wondered how long it would take for Veronica to receive the news, or if she would at all, just in case. I loaded one of the videos into the player and turned on the TV. 1 button push, and she would witness herself in provocative film clips, signaling the end of many things, including our marriage. I went upstairs for a nap and had an idea. I returned to the phone, grabbed the pad, and wrote a note. Play video. An hour later, I heard her car in the garage door. She was home. Waiting at the top of the stairs, mostly out of sight, I saw her pause in front of the TV, reading the note on the tape. She approached the player and pressed start. I could sense her nervousness. Although I couldn't see the video, no more than a minute into it, she fainted. The video continued playing. I descended and turned off the machine. She regained consciousness about half an hour later. I sat on the couch, waiting for her to come to. She spotted me. She groggily asked if I hated her, to which I replied affirmatively, stating there was no chance for reconciliation. Offering her the house and allowing the kids to live with her, I asserted my ownership of everything else: stocks, bonds, savings. I presented the option of preserving a bit of her self-respect if she didn't fight me, but warned of ruining her if she chose to resist. Expressing remorse, Veronica explained that she felt compelled to take certain actions. Despite her apology, I deemed her actions unforgivable and warned her that the consequences had caught up with her. The Mintu was in the process of being ruined, and I advised her not to answer her cell anytime soon, anticipating she wouldn't be welcome around the kids. I informed her that I had already leased a place, and Bobby would take the children there after school. Although she would have visitation rights, I made it clear that none of her male friends were welcome. She nodded in understanding. To her credit, she hadn't started crying or making excuses. Anticipating the tears would come about 2 minutes after I left, I proceeded to leave. Now, all the married individuals were divorced by their wives and taken to the cleaners. The priest was reassigned, but I never found out where the Pole is now. Selling used cars, maybe. Veronica still works for the dean and sees the children often. It was challenging to help them understand why Mommy no longer lived with us, but somehow we got through it. Veronica occasionally dates. Some office friends may set her up, but that's just speculation. I know for a fact that the idea of promiscuity no longer appeals to her. She'll be with us at Christmas. She's still family, but she acknowledges she made a significant mistake and has the decency not to push it with me. Lovemaking, lovemaking, lovemaking. It can be such a destroyer. Second story. I've been married to my wife for 4 years, having dated for 2 before getting married. Although we are still relatively new to marriage, our relationship seemed robust with no signs of trouble. Our love was genuine, and we built a foundation of trust during our courtship. I'm 30, and she's 26. The incident that exposed my wife's infidelity happened on July 4th during a party organized by her friend. Let me provide some context before discussing the incident itself. About a week before July 4th, my wife mentioned her friend's July 4th celebration, and we usually have a reliable babysitter for our 3-year-old. We usually inform the sitter in advance about our babysitting needs for this specific July 4th event. My wife informed me that she had contacted the babysitter, who mentioned her schedule would be packed and she couldn't make it. I was disappointed because spending time with my wife had become rarer since we had our baby. Despite my reservations about her friend, my wife expressed a strong desire to attend the event and suggested I stay home with our child while she goes to her friend's party. Wanting her to have fun, I agreed, saying, "I'll take care of our child at home." Here's the twist. My wife knew I wasn't a big fan of her friend, who is still single and 3 years younger, a bit more carefree. I didn't want to come across as controlling, advising her to watch out for her friend, as she might not be the best influence. On the morning of July 4th, I took an unusual step and decided to call the babysitter myself. Normally, my wife handles these arrangements, and I had to find the sitter's number on her phone. I thought offering the babysitter a higher hourly rate might change her mind. If it worked out, I planned to surprise my wife and let her know we could go to the event together. After all, I wanted to share the news once I had the babysitter situation sorted out and enjoy the satisfaction of pulling off a last-minute miracle. Things started to unravel when I called the babysitter and asked her to reconsider sitting for my son that evening. Even though she had initially declined, she appeared surprised when I used the word reconsider and told me it was the first time I had asked her about that day. Her surprise caught me off guard, and I inquired if she remembered my wife calling her to arrange the evening. A week earlier, she confirmed she hadn't received any call from my wife. I quickly improvised, telling her that my wife had actually called a family member instead. It became clear that my wife had lied for some reason, though I couldn't figure out why, causing concern. I arranged for the sitter to come to our house at 10 p.m., and my wife mentioned she would be leaving around 8 p.m. for the event. Before ending the call with the sitter, I made sure to tell her not to inform my wife about her coming over. I explained that I wanted to surprise my wife and keep the outing I had planned a secret. I almost stumbled over my words, When the sitter reminded me that I had mentioned my wife's earlier attempt to secure the date and time, I managed to cover it up by saying that we both thought the date night might have been canceled, but since she was on board, it would still be a nice surprise. As planned, my wife left around 8 p.m. I patiently waited for the sitter, who arrived on time. Once she was there, I headed to the party my wife had mentioned. Honestly, I had a suspicion that she might not show up and go somewhere else instead, but to my surprise, she was indeed at the party. Her friend greeted me upon my arrival, and seeing me there surprised her. She quickly called my wife over. It's an understatement to say she was just shocked. Her reaction was more like utter disbelief. It had only been around 3 hours since my wife left home, but she already seemed quite intoxicated. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her reception towards me was chilly. She repeatedly asked why I was there and who was taking care of our child. I reassured her that I had the babysitter situation under control, and she shouldn't worry. I just wanted us to enjoy the evening together and watch the fireworks display. The party, in a medium-sized setting with maybe 15, 20 people, had a noticeable gender ratio, more guys than girls, almost like a 2-to-1 ratio. We managed to move past the awkward initial interaction, but that still didn't explain why my wife had been deceptive about the outing. The event seemed to revolve around a game night with a focus on playing truth or dare games. I overheard one of the guys suggesting they get back to the game. I decided it was time to catch up on what I had missed, and joined a friendly group of guys, the ones quite talkative due to the flowing drinks or their outgoing personalities. Amidst the gathering, my wife's behavior became agitated and uneasy, and she expressed her desire to leave and go home. Her sudden request to leave raised a red flag for me, suggesting that she was definitely hiding something. I assured her we could head home, but I asked for a moment to try some drinks since I had just arrived. I headed to the kitchen and struck up a conversation with one of the guys there. After introducing myself to a random guy, I inquired if he was enjoying the party. He introduced himself as well and confirmed that he was indeed having a good time. I told him I was interested in making a move on one of the girls at the party, but I wasn't sure who was available. I began pointing to the different girls one by one, and he helped me identify who was already in a relationship and who seemed open to approach. Using this approach, I eventually pointed to my wife without revealing her identity to the stranger. I then asked him what he thought about her. He mentioned that my wife was attractive, but he warned me that she was off limits because she arrived with the guy he knew as a friend. I pretended to be interested and asked him to share more details about this guy. The stranger went on to give me information about my wife's affair partner, explaining that they had met at a concert and had been involved with each other fornicatorily since then. This revelation really hit me hard. The timeline of when my wife attended the concert and met this guy matched up perfectly. This struck a chord because I was also present at that very same concert. What bothered me was the fact that I was with her most of the time during the event, except when she wanted to get some snacks and insisted on going alone. I recall that it took her an unusually long time to return with her snacks, but I brushed it off, assuming there was a long line or she needed to use the restroom. This incident occurred about a month ago, and since then, she has been frequently leaving the house and even had a trip out of town. This new revelation left me questioning everything. The stranger was boasting about my wife as if she were some kind of prize he had won for his friend. He kept on talking, sharing a few more details. He explained that he had come to the party to pursue my wife's friend. When he described her as a free spirit, I wasn't sure if my reaction was noticeable, but I couldn't fake it anymore. Just then, my wife's friend joined the conversation, possibly realizing that my questions were leading to the truth about my wife's affair. However, it was too late, and I could tell that she was also part of the deception. I excused myself from the conversation but asked my wife's friend about my wife's whereabouts. She suggested checking the patio, and that's where I found my wife talking to the guy. It seemed like they were either having a heated discussion or she was trying to convince him of something. I approached them and introduced myself to the man who was involved with my wife, but before I could say anything to him, my wife hastily pulled me away, insisting that we should leave the party. I swatted her hand away with anger and told her she could leave because I wanted to have a talk with the man. I confronted him directly, introducing myself as her husband. I asked him straightforwardly if he knew my wife was married before getting involved with her. Considering I had already discovered the truth about their relationship, I have a somewhat imposing presence that I use to my advantage in confrontations. Honestly, I wasn't looking to fight him if he genuinely didn't know she was married. My little show of subtle aggression was meant to let my wife know that I had uncovered her infidelity and to unsettle the guy a bit. I repeated my question to him, making it clear that I didn't want to ruin the party by starting a brawl, but I needed to know if he was aware of my wife's marital status before getting involved with her. My wife was getting anxious and tried to hold me back while apologizing. The guy, seeing the bottle in my hand and realizing he was cornered on the patio with no support, fell for my act and started apologizing as well. He mentioned that he didn't intend to cause any trouble and that he had only started talking to my wife without knowing she was married. I inquired about the number of times they had been together, and he gave a response. I simply wished him a good night and walked away. I hopped in my car and drove back home. I told my wife that I wanted a divorce. I checked into a hotel where I'm writing down my story as a form of self-therapy. I'm feeling lost about what steps to take. This is my first experience with divorce, and I'm completely unfamiliar with co-parenting since I didn't grow up in a household like that. What I do know is that I can't bear the thought of seeing that woman, and this incident is making me physically sick.
Story 3.
My earliest memories are steeped in the smell of freshly baked bread from my mother's kitchen and the clanging of tools in my father's workshop. Growing up in a small New York town, life was simple but full of purpose. The routines of daily life, coupled with a strong sense of community, taught me the value of hard work and persistence. My parents were the anchors of my world, providing stability and warmth even when the winters were harsh and resources were scarce. I remember dreaming of the day I would carve out my own path, blending the lessons they taught me with aspirations of a brighter, independent future. As I grew older, the desire to explore life beyond the confines of my childhood home only intensified. After high school, I ventured into the unknown, armed with ambition and an unshakable belief in a better tomorrow. Through struggles and triumphs, I built a life defined by resilience and a relentless pursuit of happiness. Yet, as the years unfolded, life's unpredictability often brought me back to the grounding lessons of my youth, lessons that would shape the decisions I faced later in life. Both of my children were grown-ups now. That was one of the reasons I decided to sell the farmhouse located outside Rochester. The other motivation was that I had grown tired of enduring the harsh winters. This part of the country could be productive, sure, but I no longer had any compelling reason to remain. I wanted to spend the rest of my life basking in sunny warmth, ideally alongside a wonderful woman. Now that's what I call a dream. My son worked as a teacher in North Carolina, while my daughter had recently gotten married and was expecting a baby after Christmas, which would make me a grandfather. Last year, she and her husband relocated to California. Maybe the warmer climate had something to do with her newfound family plans. Having sold the farm, I was sorting through the belongings that defined my years here. The movers would ensure everything reached California safely. My task was simply to label what was coming with me and pack the sentimental items. Most of the furniture stayed behind for the young couple who bought the place. It was their first real home. I only kept the books from my library and the original art that adorned the walls. The property spanned roughly 20 acres, complete with a spacious old house, 2 barns, a detached garage with room for 4 cars, and extensive fencing for the horses. Well, maybe not quite endless, but when you're the one painting it, it sure feels that way. This place carried a lifetime of memories. It was the first home I purchased for my kids after my wife left me for her lover, seeking escape from what she deemed a monotonous life with me. I raised my twins, Kelly and Brian Jr., here. Watching them grow into adults was a journey full of scrapes, arguments, and countless cherished moments. That was more than 2 decades ago now. Let me take a step back and explain things from the beginning. My name is Brian Carter. I was born in southern New York State, in a small town where nobody bothered locking their doors and Sundays were reserved for church services. You know the kind of town, where the highlight of the week might be watching the grass grow. My mother, who had a college education, passed on her knowledge to me, while my father ran a store. He worked tirelessly to ensure we had everything we needed for a comfortable life. When I was big enough to hold my own, my mother convinced my father that I should start music lessons. Now, neither of them played an instrument, so they didn't know much about the various options. They skipped over woodwinds and strings and instead wandered into a piano shop. As a kid, my first thought was, how am I supposed to manage one of those things in the Memorial Day parade? It worried me a lot. Keep in mind, I was just 11 years old, and the modern era of keyboards was still years away. The salesman at the store, however, was a pro. We had gone in intending to buy a small piano, but ended up purchasing an organ instead. Of course, we didn't leave with it that day. It was scheduled for delivery in 2 weeks. The organ wasn't brand new. It had been owned by a family whose circumstances changed when the husband was transferred out of state, and they decided against paying the steep cost of shipping it. That's likely why we got it. It was inexpensive. The store had already profited from its original sale and didn't need to charge much the second time around. I started taking lessons once a week and practiced an hour daily all through high school. At first, my mom wanted me to practice right after school, but that cut into my time with friends. My dad came up with a solution. If you practice right after dinner, I'll take over your dish-drying chore, he offered. You can stop practicing as soon as the dishes are done. At the time, I thought it was a great deal since I despised drying dishes. Normally, it took about 15 minutes, but somehow my dad stretched it to an hour. It was years before I caught on. By then, though, I genuinely enjoyed playing, and practicing no longer felt like a burden. In my teenage years, my taste in music shifted toward the rock and roll of my generation. The challenge was that most bands back then didn't use organs. They relied on guitars and drums. So I had to figure out how to replicate those sounds with the organ, using both hands and feet. Over time, I got pretty skilled at mimicking the sounds of popular bands. During my senior year of high school, my guidance counselor encouraged me to consider music school instead of a traditional college. To my surprise, I was invited to audition at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. With my organ teacher's help, I prepared classical pieces and refined my technique in the weeks leading up to the audition. When the day arrived, I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't eat or sleep, and my hands shook as I waited in the hallway outside the practice room. Other applicants sat silently around me, all lost in their own anxieties. When my name was called, I stepped into the audition room and was greeted by 3 kind-looking women and a piano. But I didn't play piano. Unlike an organ, a piano required a completely different touch, and I had never developed that skill. Staring at the unfamiliar instrument, I froze. One of the women noticed and asked gently, "Is there a problem, Mr. Carter?" I managed to nod. "Yes, ma'am, I don't play piano. I'm an organist." She pressed further. "You've never learned on a piano?" "No, ma'am," I admitted. "I've only ever played organ. If I'd known a piano was required, I wouldn't have come." The women exchanged whispers before one left the room. A few minutes later, she returned, smiling. "Mr. Carter, please gather your things and follow us. We've located an available organ." Relieved but still nervous, I followed them through the building. The halls were magnificent, marble floors, walls, and ceilings, with brass light fixtures and ornate oak doors. It was a far cry from the utilitarian corridors of modern schools. As we walked, the sound of music grew louder. We eventually arrived at a set of oversized double doors. One of the women opened them and the music swelled around us. Inside was an auditorium, with red velvet seats and a dazzling chandelier suspended from an intricately decorated ceiling. I later learned that George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, had donated the theater to the school in the early 1900s. "The Philharmonic is wrapping up their practice session," one of the women informed me. Another added, "Actually, that's the jazz ensemble. They play more contemporary music." The conductor brought the musicians to a dramatic finish and gave them a few parting instructions. As he prepared to leave, he noticed our group approaching. Turning back to his ensemble, he announced, "There's an audition happening on the organ for a prospective student. Let's make sure we exit quietly. It's a stressful experience." The room fell silent as I glanced around. All eyes were on me. Some of the musicians smiled, others nodded, and I could feel their acknowledgement. These were professionals, legends in their own right. And they were recognizing me, a 17-year-old kid from the middle of nowhere. But there wasn't much time to soak it all in. One of the women ushered me into the orchestra pit and began setting up the enormous concert organ. As I settled onto the bench, she walked me through the intricate layout of the massive console. I had never encountered anything like it before, and my chest tightened as panic set in. Failure felt inevitable. "It's a pipe organ," she explained. "There's a slight delay between pressing the keys and hearing the sound. I hope that won't be an issue for you. Let's start with some scales to warm up." Nodding, I played through the scales a few times. The lag wasn't as bad as I feared, and I quickly adapted. Soon after, another woman approached, handing me sheet music with a simple command, "Play." So I played. For 2 hours straight, I performed piece after piece while they evaluated me. When it was finally over, I climbed out of the pit, feeling drained but oddly satisfied. The women thanked me and said, "You'll receive your results in the mail within 2 months." As they left, I stood there, unsure of what to do next. Just as I turned to go, a single pair of hands began clapping. The applause quickly spread, and I realized the jazz ensemble had stayed to listen. They were cheering for me. A few even shouted words of encouragement. My heart swelled with pride as their applause wrapped around me like a warm embrace. For a brief moment, I felt seen, not as a kid trying to make it, but as an equal. The conductor, who had been seated in the back of the theater, approached me. "When you graduate, come find me," he said with a knowing smile. "I think I'll have a spot for you in one of my ensembles." 3 agonizing weeks later, I came home from school to my mom standing in the kitchen, a smile lighting up her face. "The Eastman School called," she said. "You've been accepted. Full 4-year scholarship. You start in the fall." And just like that, the next 4 years of my life were set. A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was October, and the weather was every bit as miserable as you'd expect. Cold, wet, and unrelenting. Soon, though, I wouldn't have to endure it. I was moving to California, a place where such dreary weather was practically outlawed. I stepped into the kitchen to make coffee, only to remember that all my appliances had already been packed for the move. Opening the fridge, I hoped to find a beer or soda, but it was spotless and empty. Damn, these movers were efficient. With nothing to drink, I briefly considered ordering a cup of coffee from the local diner, then laughed at myself for the ridiculous thought. Resigned, I decided to brave the cold and walk into the village for a warm drink. But another fierce gust of wind howled against the house, making me rethink that plan. Coffee wasn't worth braving the storm. Instead, I wandered into the living room and began taking down the paintings I wanted to bring with me. Over the years, I had developed a passion for the art of the Wyeth family. It started with N.C. Wyeth's illustrations, especially those from classic children's books. I collected first editions featuring his work, along with high-quality reproductions of his paintings. Later, I branched out to the art of his son, Andrew Wyeth, who captured the essence of rural Pennsylvania in his vivid landscapes. My collection even extended to Jamie Wyeth, Andrew's son. My favorite piece of his was Pig, a breathtakingly detailed portrait of a pig that I had seen in a museum outside Wilmington, Delaware. I bought a smaller reproduction that day, and it became one of my prized possessions. Though I owned no originals, the cost of acquiring, insuring, and securing them was too high. I took pride in my collection of museum-grade reproductions. They were beautiful, fit seamlessly into my home, and spared me the headache of having to explain why an empty frame hung on my wall with a "Loan to the Met" tag. Opposite the artwork hung my music industry awards. No, I hadn't become a household name or churned out platinum albums. My voice was decent, my looks unremarkable. And let's face it, organ music wasn't exactly the sound that topped the charts. Instead, I found success behind the scenes. My music education taught me how to compose both lyrics and melodies, and I had a knack for imitating the styles of other artists. I could write songs that sounded like they belonged to Frank Sinatra or another legend, blending nostalgia with originality. But this wasn't an overnight success. In the early years, I worked in a dull office, shuffling papers and inching my way up the corporate ladder to support my family. My big break in music came much later. As I thought back on those days, memories of my early struggles bubbled to the surface. After graduating from Eastman, I didn't land a dream job in music or become the next big thing. In reality, I didn't even have a lead. My degree, impressive as it was, didn't open doors the way I'd hoped. I ended up as a lowly clerk at a manufacturing company, surrounded by rows of identical desks. It seemed like I was destined to spend decades pushing paper. In my single days, I spent my nights doing the typical bachelor things, frequenting bars, catching football games, and attending car races. Bar hopping, in particular, was my go-to activity. The challenge, though, was deciding between hitting up lively venues with live bands, packed with guys vying for the same women, and the quieter neighborhood pubs where I could just hang out with my buddies. Of course, the bars with bands came with a steep price, cover charges and inflated drink prices, but they were also my best chance to meet women. As much as I hated the expense, the alternative was spending another night nursing beers with my friends, which didn't exactly help my dating life. Being an underpaid office clerk with both rent and car payments, I had to be strategic about my nights out. Most evenings, I stuck to cheap pitchers of beer with the guys, saving the club outings for Fridays or Saturdays. On those nights, I'd sip a couple of drinks over the course of the evening, trying to look cool. It was during one of these weekend outings that I met Mary. Mary was about 5'6", with a figure that could stop traffic. She was cute, friendly, and carried herself with a confidence that made her even more attractive. We danced the night away and spent the evening talking and laughing, getting to know each other. It took a couple more weekends of running into her at the club before I managed to get her out to my car. We kissed and fooled around a bit in the back seat, but she always stopped things before they went too far, insisting we head back inside. She had no trouble re-entering the club. Being a woman, the bouncers waved her through. But I, broke as I was, couldn't afford the re-entry fee. That pretty much summed up our dynamic. Mary always had the upper hand. A month later, I saw her again, sitting with a group of friends. She smiled at me as I approached, and we shared a couple of dances. But halfway through the second song, another guy walked up, wrapped his arms around her, and kissed her like they were in a movie. I froze, ready to intervene, until I saw Mary enthusiastically returning the embrace. Feeling like a third wheel, I slipped back to the bar, only to find my drink, jacket, and seat had all been claimed by someone else. By the time I spotted Mary again, she was heading out the door with her new guy. I walked home that night, shivering without my jacket, and growing increasingly bitter toward her with every step. Over the next few months, I kept running into Mary at various clubs. We'd exchange polite nods, but I never asked her to dance or tried to restart anything. Instead, I focused on meeting other women. At 6 feet tall with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, I wasn't exactly bad looking. I'd even been told I was easy on the eyes. Still, I wasn't bold, and my reserved nature often left me overlooked. "You're just too shy," women would say. Maybe they were right, but it was how I was raised, not to push or pressure anyone. One night, while I was taking a break at the bar, I heard a familiar voice. "Hi, Brian. Don't you want to dance with me anymore?" It was Mary, standing behind me with a playful smile. "I'm just taking a breather," I replied coolly. "Work tomorrow, you know." "But Brian, I want to dance." "Mary," I said, my tone sharpening, "this place is packed. I'm sure someone will be happy to dance with you and walk you out to the parking lot." Before she could respond, I stood up and headed for the door. She tried to follow, but a couple of guys intercepted her, eager for her attention. The last thing I saw before leaving was her flirting with them as though I'd never been there. Rochester wasn't a huge city, so there weren't many clubs with dance floors, which meant I kept bumping into Mary. For months, we continued our awkward avoidance routine. Sometimes, though, I swore I caught her watching me. Still, I stayed distant, figuring it was for the best. That all changed one night as I was walking to my truck after leaving a club. The sound of a woman crying out caught my attention. It wasn't the kind of noise you hear during a good time. It was sharp, desperate. Grabbing a nearby push broom, I broke the handle, fashioning a makeshift club, and headed toward the sound. My heart raced as I approached, listening for any sign of what was happening. I heard fabric tearing, a man cursing in pain, and the unmistakable sound of a fist hitting. Picking up speed, I rounded the corner of a parked car and froze. 2 men were pinning a woman to the ground. One held her down while the other struggled to pull off her jeans. Her terrified eyes met mine, and I realized with a sickening jolt, it was Mary. Without hesitation, I charged toward them, gripping my makeshift weapon tightly, ready to fight for her safety. The instinct to act took over before I even thought it through. I swung the broom handle, striking the man, pinning her down, connecting hard. He stumbled back, collapsing. The second man, who had been trying to forcefully restrain her, froze before scrambling to his feet. I acted again with my makeshift club, striking him on the side. He staggered but tried to get up, so I struck again. I didn't stop until someone intervened and pulled me back. In hindsight, it's a good thing they did. I might have gone too far. The bouncers restrained me until the police arrived. Once everything was under control, the 2 individuals were taken to the hospital and later charged with attempted misconduct. A detective interviewed me about what had happened. He sternly reminded me of the risks of intervening in such situations, how I could have been seriously hurt, and how I should have let law enforcement handle it. But after delivering his lecture, he leaned in and whispered, "Good job, son." Later, I learned that these men had been involved in a string of attacks in the area. That night, I also found out the details of what Mary had been through. She had arrived at the club with a friend who left her behind, and she'd accepted a ride home from one of the attackers. Instead of taking her home, they drove to the back of the parking lot, where their intentions became clear. Mary fought hard, scratching one guy's face and struggling to get free, but the other grabbed her. If I hadn't come along, she might not have survived. A policewoman wrapped Mary in a blanket and brought her over to me. She was trembling, her jeans torn, and clutching at what was left of her bra for modesty. When she saw me, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. She clung to me like her life depended on it, and I had no choice but to scoop her up and carry her to my truck. The officer followed, carrying Mary's purse and helping me get her settled in the passenger seat while keeping her decency intact. I didn't know where Mary lived, so I brought her to my apartment. My plan was simple. Let her rest in my bed while I slept on the couch, then figure things out in the morning. But that plan went out the window quickly. For the next few nights, the only way Mary could sleep was in my arms. She woke up screaming whenever I tried to leave her alone, so I stayed. Holding her, comforting her. It wasn't exactly a hardship, but I did my best to be respectful. Mary never returned to her apartment. 6 months later, when her lease ended, she let it go without a second thought. She'd been living with me since the night of the attack. And by then, it was clear that neither of us wanted her to leave. Years later, I was back at my old farmhouse, tying up loose ends. The house had been emptied out. All the furniture, linens, and other belongings had either been packed for my new place or donated. When I heard a knock at the back door, I thought it might be the cab I'd called to take me back to the city. Opening the door, I got the shock of my life. It was Mary, but not the Mary I remembered. She looked frail, her frame so slight she couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds soaking wet. Her clothes hung on her like rags, and her face was a patchwork of scars. Her nose had been broken and flattened, and a jagged scar ran from her temple across her face, ending near her mouth. Most shocking of all was the eye patch she wore. It wasn't just for show. I knew instinctively there was nothing underneath it. My mind snapped back to the day she left. A memory burned into my mind. I had been at work when my supervisor handed me a note. "Your neighbor called," he said. "Your kids are at her house. Your wife isn't home." Confused and worried, I called the neighbor, who explained that my 6-year-old twins were safe at her place. But something was very wrong. "Mary moved out," she said. "Around 10 this morning, a van showed up and she and 2 men loaded it with her things. They left the house wide open. I went over after they left to lock up, but the place was a disaster. Drawers overturned, clothes everywhere. Another neighbor and I spent the afternoon cleaning up so the kids wouldn't be scared. I'd driven home in a daze, unsure what to expect. When I arrived, Sue Sharp, my neighbor, met me at the car. "Brian," she said gently, "I'm so sorry." Mary didn't just leave. She made a scene. Those guys she was with, they were all over each other, laughing and groping. It was disgusting. I thanked her numbly, words failing me. Now, standing face to face with Mary all these years later, I felt the weight of those memories pressing down, mingled with the shock of her appearance. What had happened to her in the time since she walked out of our lives? The days following Mary's departure were a whirlwind of activity. I spent hours meeting with lawyers, closing bank accounts, freezing credit cards, and taking care of everything necessary to protect myself and the kids. The hardest part, though, was explaining to Kelly and Brian Jr. where their mom had gone. I didn't know, so I told them a half-truth. It was painful to lie, but I couldn't bear to let them feel the hurt I was carrying. Kelly burst into tears, worried her mom was hurt or lost, while Brian Jr. held her close, his face calm and stoic. It was a bond only twins could understand. The divorce took nearly a year to finalize. Since Mary couldn't be located, my lawyer filed on grounds of desertion. There were no arguments about child support, alimony, or visitation rights. As far as the court was concerned, she no longer existed in our lives. Technically, it takes 7 years to declare someone legally dead, but for me and the kids, that chapter was closed. After putting the kids to bed each night, I found solace in my music. Sitting at my organ, I began composing and writing lyrics, tailoring each song to the styles of various artists I admired. Over time, I became skilled at mimicking their sounds. Occasionally, I'd play for neighbors who would swear they recognized the song as something by the Beatles or another famous band, but couldn't quite place it. Their reactions made me smile, knowing I had created the music from scratch. It became a passion, filling the quiet evenings with purpose. One day, I ran into Jake, a classmate from my Eastman days. He'd had some moderate success with a few hit albums, but was struggling creatively when we reconnected. As we caught up, the conversation kept circling back to his slump. He was frustrated and desperate for inspiration. Wanting to help, I invited him to my house under the pretense of visiting the kids. After we played some music together, I had a sense of his style and decided to share one of my songs with him. We played it a few times, refining it until he felt comfortable. The next morning, I found Jake in my driveway at the crack of dawn, excited as a kid on Christmas morning. He'd stayed up all night tweaking the lyrics and was eager to share the revised version. Over coffee and breakfast, he performed it for me and the kids, who were thrilled to see a song come to life before their eyes. Jake and I spent the entire weekend working on more songs. By Sunday evening, he left my house with 10 new tracks, already coordinating practice sessions with his band as he walked to his car. A month later, Kelly burst into the house shouting for me to turn on the radio. One of the songs Jake and I had worked on was playing, climbing the charts fast. Hearing my music on the radio was surreal, even if no one but Jake, the kids, and I knew I'd written it. For a moment, I felt a quiet pride. A few days later, Jake called with more good news. "The label wants to do an entire album around this new sound," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "Jake, that's incredible," I replied. "I'm so happy to see your career taking off again." "Brian, it's your music," he insisted. "I set you up with an agent. You're going to get every cent of the royalties you deserve." At first, I protested. "Jake, those songs were my gift to you. I don't want to profit from your success." "Stop being a martyr," he shot back. "This is my way of saying thank you." Within a few months, royalty checks started arriving. Initially, they were substantial, like having a well-paying second job. Over time, as Jake and his band found their stride, the checks became smaller, eventually tapering off. Still, the experience had been rewarding. Jake had his mojo back, and I felt fulfilled knowing I'd helped. 2 years later, the phone rang one evening. This time, I answered it myself, expecting another teenage boy calling for Kelly. Instead, it was Jake. "Hey, Brian, how's the new place? You getting settled in?" "A little," I admitted. "Still setting up." "Good, because I have someone who could use your help." "What kind of help?" I asked cautiously. "She's looking to make a comeback, but needs music in her old style. She's been struggling, and I told her you're the guy who can deliver." "Who are we talking about?" I asked, intrigued. When Jake said her name, I nearly dropped the phone. She was a multi-platinum artist, a household name. I felt a wave of both awe and doubt. "I don't know, Jake. She's a legend. I'm just a guy who writes songs in his living room. She's willing to move into your house for a couple of weeks so you can work together," he added, laughing. "But I warned her, you're all business." "Jake, my kids are home. There's no room for anything but songwriting." A week later, Kelly handed me a message from Jake. "Be at the airport at 7 a.m. on Saturday to meet your house guest," it read. When Kelly asked who was coming, I simply said, "A friend. We're going to make music." Saturday morning found the three of us, me, Kelly, and Brian Jr., standing near the airport's arrivals area, scanning the crowd for Jake's friend. Kelly and Brian were craning their necks, clearly expecting someone glamorous or flashy, while I kept my own expectations grounded. Suddenly, a woman with an unassuming demeanor approached me. She looked like an everyday suburban mom, baggy clothes, oversized sunglasses. But when she spoke, I recognized her instantly. "Are you Brian Carter?" she asked, her voice as smooth and unmistakable as ever. I nodded, fighting back the surprise. "That's me," I said, turning to the kids. "Okay, team, she's here. Let's go." The woman smiled warmly and said, "Please, call me Beth." Kelly froze for a moment, her eyes widening as the voice she was hearing clashed with the plain appearance in front of her. Before she could blurt out the truth, I managed to cover her mouth with my hand. "Beth, these are my kids, Kelly and Brian Jr. Welcome to town. Let's grab your luggage and find some breakfast." Brian Jr., eager as ever to get behind the wheel, volunteered to retrieve the car from the parking garage. Any excuse to drive would do for him. Once, he'd even suggested driving next door to borrow milk, claiming it would get home faster and stay fresher. I made him walk, of course. Parenting a teenage driver is like a crash course in patience, and in my case, prematurely graying hair. While we waited for him to pull up, Kelly and Beth struck up an animated conversation, whispering and laughing like old friends. Watching them, I felt a pang of bitterness toward Mary, their mother, who had walked away from her children. I could understand someone leaving a spouse, but abandoning her kids, that was something I'd never be able to comprehend. My thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable screech of tires against the curb. Brian Jr. had arrived, albeit with a bit of flair. I sighed. At least tires were cheaper to replace than fenders or bones. We loaded Beth's luggage into the car and headed home. That evening, once the kids were settled, Beth and I sat them down to explain her presence. I laid down the rules firmly. "To your friends, she's just my cousin Beth from California. No exceptions. If anyone finds out who she really is, you'll both be grounded for life. And I mean it. The seriousness of my tone must have gotten through. The kids nodded solemnly before heading off to bed. As soon as they were out of earshot, Beth turned to me. "Don't you think that was a little harsh?" she asked. "No," I replied. "Kids talk without thinking. The last thing we need is for your visit to make headlines." She considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough, but you've done an incredible job with them, Brian. I've seen that in just one day." "Thanks," I said. "It hasn't been easy, but I wasn't about to walk out on them like their mother did." Changing the subject, we dove into the music. Hours passed as we worked in my studio, experimenting with melodies and lyrics. By the time the sun began to rise, we finally called it a night. The next morning, the kids let their teenage tendencies shine. Sleeping in well past 10 a.m., I stumbled downstairs, still half asleep, intending to quiet them down. Beth needed rest after our late-night session, and with her internal clock still on West Coast time, she could use all the extra sleep she could get. I promised the kids I'd cook their favorite breakfast after a quick shower, hoping a little bribery would keep them from making too much noise. When I came back downstairs, showered and dressed, I was greeted by the most delicious smells wafting from the kitchen. To my surprise, there was Beth, standing at the stove, flipping pancakes like she owned the place. But that wasn't the shocker. Kelly, my daughter who had never shown the slightest interest in cooking, was standing beside her, helping. "Hi, Dad," Kelly chirped. "Beth's teaching me how to cook breakfast. Look, I made the pancake batter from scratch. Want some eggs and bacon too?" I blinked, half expecting the scene to dissolve into a dream. This was the same girl who fought tooth and nail against loading the dishwasher, now offering to make me pancakes. I rubbed my temple and muttered, "I think I need coffee." Beth lingered in the background, her smile radiant. I was nearly overcome with emotion, my pride for my daughter's achievements swelling to the point of tears. Her voice rang with joy, and I couldn't have been prouder. "I'll have a little of everything," I replied with a grin. The breakfast was delightful, extra crunchy pancakes and all. I ate every bite with a smile, relishing the moment. Teen boys, of course, will devour anything in sight, but Kelly's pride was unmistakable. Afterward, Beth and I tackled the kitchen disaster while Kelly basked in the glory of her culinary triumph. I had almost forgotten how messy a new cook could be. It took us an extra 30 minutes to restore the kitchen to a semi-clean state. Later that afternoon, Beth and I were taking a break from working on our music. She turned to me and said, "Kelly really needs a female role model right now. I'd like to step into that role if you'll let me." Her words caught me off guard. "Wow, I hadn't even considered that," I admitted. "I'd love for you to be her mentor, but there's a catch. You're only here for a couple of weeks. We have to think about how Kelly will feel when you leave." Beth cut me off before I could continue. "Brian, I've thought it through. First, there's the phone. We can talk every day. Second, we're making incredible music together. After I head home, I'll need studio time to finalize everything. Then I'll be back to work with you. You might not realize it, but you've got a gift, and I'll need more of your songs, and—" I tried to chime in, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Quiet, let me finish," she said, smiling. "When summer vacation rolls around, I'd like Kelly to spend some time with me on the West Coast. She could use a woman's perspective. I promised to take good care of her and bring her back safe and sound." Just then, Kelly walked into the room. "Why'd you guys stop working? I want to hear what you've written. By the way, Beth, my dad is the best songwriter ever." Tears welled in my eyes, and Beth reached over, squeezing my hand gently. "So, do we have a deal?" she asked softly. All I could do was nod in agreement. Beth smiled. "Kelly, why don't you put on the kettle for your dad and me?" she suggested. Our songwriting spanned nearly 2 months, slowed by my day job. By the end, we'd composed enough material for almost 2 albums. During this time, Kelly and Beth were inseparable. As Beth's departure approached, Kelly grew quieter. One night, they disappeared into Kelly's room for an hour. When Kelly emerged, she flung herself into my lap, hugging me tightly. "Daddy, you're the best dad ever," she said, tears streaming down her face. I looked up to see Beth standing in the doorway. "I told her about our summer plans," Beth explained. "Looks like she's on board." When Beth returned to California, her daily phone calls with Kelly became a ritual. Eventually, I had to get Kelly her own phone to keep the home line free. Beth's album skyrocketed to the top of the charts, her incredible voice belting out our songs wherever you went. 3 months later, I was at the airport waiting for her plane to arrive. She stepped off in a clever disguise, a brown wig with streaks of gray and enough padding to make her appear much heavier. This time, her stay stretched to 4 months, including a wonderful family Christmas. 2 nights after Christmas, I felt someone slipping into my bed. That familiar voice whispered, "Here's the rest of your Christmas gift," as she wrapped herself around me. We didn't sleep for hours, and when morning came, we stayed in bed, relishing each other's company, until a knock on the door interrupted us. "Breakfast is in 30 minutes, Kelly called. "Get moving," Beth laughed. "Caught," she whispered. We both burst into laughter as we headed to the shower. If not for Beth's repeated no, we might have missed breakfast altogether. By May, Beth was preparing to leave again. We had enough songs for 2 more albums and a tour. As I watched her pack, a deep sadness settled over me. Kelly entered the room with a small, beautifully wrapped package, tears streaming down her face. "I know you have to go," Kelly said, her voice breaking. "But I'll miss you so much. I wish Daddy had married you first so you could be my mom." When my son came in to announce that the car was ready, he found all 3 of us in a tearful group hug. He joined in, presenting Beth with his own gift. Once summer arrived, I put Kelly on a plane to California. She spent her summer with Beth, while my son and I enjoyed some guy time filled with fishing, hiking, and camping. Labor Day came too quickly, and before I knew it, Kelly was back home, full of stories about her summer with Beth. The bonds we had all formed continued to grow, leaving me grateful for every moment. That summer, we decided to take on a new adventure and bought a couple of retired racehorses. The learning curve was steep, and we spent most of our free time figuring out how to ride properly and nursing the inevitable soreness with liniment. Despite the aches, it turned out to be one of the most enjoyable summers of my life. By fall, I made a big decision. I quit my job. The royalty checks from Beth's music had started rolling in, and they easily surpassed what I was making at work. Meanwhile, I kept in touch with Kelly every few days. She was having the time of her life, and occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of her in the background during Beth's televised appearances. My heart ached with how much I missed them both. The tabloids even picked up on Beth's growing fame, and while their focus was on her, Kelly sometimes appeared in the edges of those glossy photos. Every time I saw their faces or heard their voices, I felt a lump in my throat. Labor Day came far too soon for Kelly, who returned home reluctantly. Back in her routine, she spent most of her time either chatting on the phone with Beth or hanging out with her friends. By then, I was missing Beth more than I could admit. That winter, Beth won multiple Grammy Awards for songs I had written. The kids and I watched the ceremony from the couch, shouting and celebrating as she took the stage. When she closed her speech with, "And a special thank you to my 3 friends back east, you know who you are," we erupted with pride. It was a surreal moment, knowing that a piece of me had reached the world through her voice. I was pulled out of this reflection by a voice I hadn't heard in years. It was Mary's. Once soft and sweet, her voice was now coarse and gravelly, worn down by years of cigarettes and alcohol. I barely recognized it. "Brian," she began, hesitating. "If you're hearing this, I guess we're divorced by now. It's been 20 years since I left you and the kids, but I need—" Her words trailed off as her mind seemed to drift back to that time in her life. Mary, then, was a woman disillusioned and restless. The twins were 6, and with them starting school, she suddenly had long, empty days to fill. Brian was at work, and the kids were away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. What she saw in her reflection was a woman who had lost her purpose. Her days blurred into hours of watching soap operas, while her friends seemed to have moved on with meaningful lives, families, careers, and goals. Mary felt trapped, a spectator in her own existence. Looking back, Mary recognized the crossroads where her life had taken a sharp turn. She had been a party girl in her youth, thriving on attention, with little ambition beyond the next good time. Meeting Brian at a club had seemed serendipitous at the time. He was well-dressed, polite, and attentive, qualities that stood out in the sea of men she usually encountered. Their chemistry was immediate, though fleeting. After a few dances and some awkward moments in the parking lot, she had dismissed him as too inexperienced to hold her interest. Instead, she sought out an old lover to satisfy her fleeting desires. Yet Brian lingered in her thoughts. Over time, their paths crossed again, and something about his sincerity broke through her jaded exterior. They fell in love, married, and started a family. For a while, it seemed like the life she hadn't known she wanted. But as the years passed, domesticity wore on her. The monotony of housework and childcare suffocated her, and she longed for the freedom she once had. One day, during an aimless stroll through a mall, she heard her name being called. It was Sherry, an old friend from her party days. They reconnected over coffee, reminiscing about the wild nights they once shared. Sherry still lived that carefree lifestyle, and Mary envied her independence. Their meetings became frequent, and soon Sherry introduced Mary to a new circle of friends. That's when Mary met Tyrone, a charming and charismatic man who reawakened her rebellious spirit. Their gatherings revolved around smoking marijuana and pushing boundaries. What started as mild flirtations spiraled into a full-blown affair. Mary didn't feel remorse. She felt alive. For the first time in years, she felt unburdened by responsibility and embraced the chaos. Over time, these rendezvous grew darker. Mary and Sherry became willing participants in increasingly debauched gatherings. Lines blurred, and boundaries vanished as they engaged in reckless behaviors, often surrounded by men who saw them as nothing more than entertainment. For Mary, it became an escape, a life where she could forget her obligations and lose herself in the moment. Looking back, Mary could see the cracks forming in her marriage, but at the time, she ignored them. She believed she was chasing freedom, though it came at the cost of everything she once held dear. As she sat before Brian now, the weight of her choices hung heavy in the air, and her words seemed stuck in her throat, unable to bridge the gap of 20 lost years. One day, Mary found herself at Tyrone's apartment with a few of his friends. The atmosphere reeked of desperation and indulgence. After her encounters with a couple of the men, she idly watched one of them preparing a needle. Without asking or warning, he plunged it into her arm. The rush that followed was unlike anything she had ever felt, intense, euphoric, and consuming. Within weeks, Mary began showing up at Tyrone's place every morning after her kids left for school. She made no effort to hide her descent. She arrived wearing only a coat and shoes, discarding the coat as soon as she entered. The encounters began immediately, often before she reached the bedroom. The needle always followed, filling her with a bliss so overpowering that she lost herself, drifting into unconsciousness. Each dose grew stronger, pulling her deeper into an abyss she didn't care to escape. Soon, Mary's obsession became her life's centerpiece. She stopped caring about anything else. One day, the men dressed her, packed some of her belongings into a van, and gave her another shot before driving away. It was the last time she ever saw her home. Her existence spiraled into a cycle of submission and pills. Mary's life was reduced to a grim routine of enduring whatever was demanded of her in exchange for the next dose. The substances became her only solace, her sole purpose. She didn't care about dignity or the cost of her actions. She lived only for the fleeting relief they provided. As time passed, Mary sank further into depravity. She remembered hazy fragments, degrading acts with men, women, and sometimes worse. She recalled performing explicit acts on stage, exposing herself to strangers, and sinking into behaviors that obliterated any semblance of her former self. Over the years, her body deteriorated and her mind became a blur. She wasn't even coherent enough to dance anymore, let alone resist. One day, Tyrone informed her that she was leaving. He had sold her to a new owner. Mary was loaded into a vehicle and transported to a brothel in Mexico, where her life became a waking nightmare. There, she was kept sedated. If a client complained, she was tortured. Time lost all meaning. She existed only in fragments of pain, brief relief from a shot, and the endless parade of customers. At one point, she became pregnant. The captors restrained her and forced a traumatic medical procedure without proper care. The experience left her in unbearable pain, both physical and emotional, with lasting scars. Her pills intake was manipulated as a means of control. Compliance brought minimal relief, while dissatisfaction led to further suffering. This cycle defined her existence, a harrowing balance between fleeting moments of reprieve and relentless torment. Time lost all meaning as her days blurred into one endless nightmare. One day, she was thrown into a van alongside others who had not survived. The air was suffocating, filled with despair and the weight of her circumstances. She knew the vehicle was heading to a remote location, and fear consumed her. Her thoughts spiraled into desperation, but her mind was too clouded to act. Eventually, the van stopped, and the silence was broken by distant sounds of chaos. She braced for the worst, but then the noise ceased. The back doors opened briefly, but the sight inside caused the onlookers to retreat, leaving her alone with the haunting stillness. Mary summoned the strength to kick open the doors and tumble onto the desert floor. Somehow, she managed to reach the front of the van, where she discovered the driver and his companion, both lifeless, their presence already drawing desert scavengers. Inside the vehicle, she found a stash of supplies: medication, water, and food. Realizing the supply was limited, she carefully rationed the medication, gradually reducing her intake to stave off withdrawal while making it last as long as possible. For the first time in years, she wasn't completely consumed by the immediate need for her next fix. But she also knew that the moment the pills ran out, the agony would return. For now, she clung to the fragile peace she'd found, unsure of what her next step would be, or if there even was one. One scorching day in a remote desert village, a poor Mexican farmer stumbled upon Mary, barely alive, huddled in the dirt near an abandoned van. Her sunburned skin and emaciated frame spoke volumes of her suffering. Without hesitation, he wrapped her in an old tattered blanket and carried her to his battered truck, driving her back to his small village. There, he entrusted her to the care of the local priest. The priest, 2 compassionate nuns, and a doctor worked tirelessly to save her. Mary endured agonizing withdrawal under the watchful eye of the doctor, who stayed with her through the relentless tremors and racking pain. Meanwhile, the priest and nuns prayed fervently for her soul. Over 6 months, Mary was nursed back to health, slowly emerging from the wreckage of her obsession, though not without scars. She bore a deep, disfiguring gash across her face and had lost one eye, a mystery even to her. The first time she saw her reflection in the mirror, her remaining eye filled with tears. Once beautiful, she now looked battered and broken. That night, overcome by despair, she attempted to take her own life. A nun caught her in time, gently bandaging her wrists and staying by her side. From then on, the nuns took shifts watching over her, ensuring she couldn't act on her pain. They removed the mirror from her room, not returning it for almost a year. When they finally brought it back, Mary accepted her new appearance with a quiet resignation. All she requested was a clean eye patch. One day, she looked at a calendar and realized 16 years had passed since the fateful day she met Sherry in the mall. Memories of her old life began to surface, her family, her children, and the life she'd left behind. Determined to return home, Mary faced her next challenge. She had no money, no identification, and no way to start her journey. The small church community came together, raising enough funds to buy her a bus ticket to Mexico City. From there, Mary worked odd jobs, scraping together enough money to continue her trip to a U.S.-Mexico border town. At the border, her lack of identification barred her entry. It took 2 years of persistence and bureaucratic struggle before she managed to obtain a green card listing her nationality as Brazilian. The designation puzzled her, but her sun-darkened skin made the claim plausible. It didn't matter. What mattered was getting into the United States. Once across the border, Mary embarked on a grueling year-long journey back to the Northeast. She took whatever work she could find, hitched rides when possible, and slept wherever she could, under bridges and alleys or wherever she wouldn't be disturbed. Her scarred face and eye patch warded off unwanted attention, as most people assumed she was dangerous or deranged. She finally made her way to Rochester, where she remembered her family's old address. But when she arrived, the new occupant told her the family had moved out over a decade ago to a small farm outside Minden, New York. The woman offered no invitation or further assistance. With the last of her money, Mary rented a dingy room in the village and began piecing together clues about her family's whereabouts. She found work on a cleaning crew, scrubbing offices at night while continuing her search during the day. Finally, late in October, she found an address. Excited and filled with hope, Mary began hitchhiking to their home. She couldn't afford a taxi, but her determination pushed her forward. Her final ride dropped her off at the entrance to a long driveway. The weather had turned bitterly cold, and rain mixed with sleet drenched her thin clothes. Wrapping her arms around herself for warmth, she began the long walk up the driveway. By the time she reached the house, she was soaked and shivering uncontrollably. Dim lights glowed from the back of the large home, guiding her through the darkness. She rang the doorbell and waited, trembling. The door opened, and there stood Brian. For the first time in 2 decades, Mary felt a flicker of light inside her battered soul. She was home, or so she thought. My expression hardened as he took in the sight of her. Memories of lonely nights, crying children, and a broken family came flooding back. Without a word, I shut the door. The sound of it closing echoed in her ears. Despair overwhelmed her, and she slumped against the door, sliding to the ground. Inside, I hesitated. Beth will never forgive me if I don't help her, he muttered to himself. Imagining her stern disapproval, he turned back and opened the door. There lay Mary, crumpled and soaked, struggling to stand. Her whispered apologies were barely audible, but the sight of her frail frame and trembling lips stirred something in him. I reached down, lifting her by the arms until she was upright. She clung to him weakly, mumbling incoherent words. I sighed, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Her body was icy to the touch, and I knew she needed help. Carrying her inside, I resolved to take the first step, unsure of what lay ahead but unwilling to let her collapse in the cold. When I realized how dire the situation was, I grabbed my phone and dialed emergency with one hand while trying to keep my composure. The state police arrived first, their flashing lights illuminating the driveway, followed closely by an ambulance. The EMTs wasted no time. They wrapped Mary in a thermal blanket, adding heat packs to help stabilize her shivering. As they worked, they coordinated with the local hospital via radio, receiving permission from a doctor to start her on an IV. I watched, numb, as they took over her care. While the EMTs worked, a state trooper approached me with a clipboard and an air of professionalism. "Do you know her?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice heavy. "She's my ex-wife." "How long have you been divorced?" he followed up. 20 years, I admitted. "I haven't seen her since she disappeared back then. I don't know what happened to her." The questions continued, but my focus kept drifting to Mary as the EMTs loaded her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Before they left, I turned to the officer. "I don't have a car here. Can you give me a ride to the hospital? I need to answer their questions too, and you can finish yours there." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke into his shoulder radio. I only caught snippets of the conversation, most of it in code, but I recognized the name of the hospital. Moments later, additional police cars pulled up, parking haphazardly across my lawn. One officer informed me that they'd be securing the house while I was away. Judging by the deep tire tracks, they weren't going to be fixing my lawn anytime soon. The trooper led me to his car, opening the back door. "Rules," he said when I hesitated. "No civilians in the front." The ride to the hospital was fast, and he spent much of it on the radio. Once we arrived, I was let out of the back seat and escorted inside. After Mary was admitted, I signed the necessary paperwork, agreeing to be financially responsible for her care. They allowed me to see her, but the trooper trailed behind, still asking his endless stream of questions. Mary was lying in a small cubicle separated from others by flimsy curtains. Oxygen tubes were in her nose, an IV hung on a pole beside her, and monitors beeped quietly around her. Her face was pale, her body frail, and her eyes closed. My chest tightened as I stood there, wrestling with a swirl of emotions. I wanted to hate her for the years of pain she had caused, but compassion for her suffering kept overriding my anger. For a moment, I wished Beth were there to ground me, to help me sort through the turmoil. But Beth was thousands of miles away in California, and I was alone. A pair of nurses and an orderly interrupted my thoughts. One of them informed me, "We're going to keep her overnight. We have a room upstairs ready for her." The other nurse added with a small smile, "She's going to be okay. Her vitals are good, and the doctor says her heart sounds strong. In a few days, she'll be back on her feet." The word home popped into my head. She doesn't have a home anymore, I thought. Not really. I stepped away to call Beth and explain the situation. She listened patiently, then grilled me with her trademark intensity, tougher than any police interrogation. When she finally calmed down, she said, "Stay with her, once we know more. If she's willing, bring her here. The kids would like to see her, and I'd like to meet her." Mary spent a week in the hospital. I stayed by her side because she wouldn't let go of my hand. Each time she woke up, she would look at me, see I was still there, and start crying. It broke something inside me to see her so fragile. The police and FBI interviewed her extensively about the past 2 decades. I learned more about her horrifying journey than I ever wanted to know. When the interviews were done, I called Beth and recounted everything. By the time I finished, we were both in tears. One day, after returning from my hotel room freshly showered, I noticed Mary's door was closed. A new sign hung on it, "Biohazard, do not enter." A nurse found me and led me to a small conference room where a doctor joined us. His expression was heavy, and I knew bad news was coming. "There's no easy way to say this," he began. "Mary has a severe, untreated STD. It's very advanced and untreatable at this stage. She has about 6 to 7 months left to live." The tears came before I could stop them. I felt gutted. All those years she had endured, clawing her way back to some semblance of life, only to be met with this. It felt cruel, unfair. I couldn't stop thinking, why now? Why this? Later that afternoon, I called Beth. After hearing the news, she said softly, "Bring her home to us. She doesn't deserve to die alone." It took another week to arrange everything. Beth worked her magic, calling in favors I could never have managed. We flew west on a private jet donated by one of her business acquaintances. When we arrived in California, Beth welcomed Mary into our home with open arms. We set her up with a health aide, making her as comfortable as possible. Whatever time she had left, she wouldn't face it alone. The first time Mary met Kelly and her husband Edward was unforgettable. Kelly, 7 months pregnant and glowing, brought Mary to tears. When Kelly tried to hug her, Mary stepped back saying, "I'm not clean. I won't risk hurting you or the baby." Kelly stayed determined. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "I need to know my mother while I can." For the rest of Mary's time with us, Kelly visited almost daily, missing only 4 days to give birth to her daughter, Mary Beth. When Beth told Mary about the baby, they cried together. Kelly brought the baby to meet both grandmothers, but Mary refused to hold her, fearing the risk of infection. My son, however, never visited. He couldn't forgive Mary for leaving, and when I explained his feelings to her, she cried, but never brought him up again. Mary grew weaker over the next 6 months. One morning she passed peacefully in her sleep. We cremated her and placed her ashes in an urn under a small garden pavilion. We often sit by her resting place, updating her on family life. Despite everything, I hope she finally found the peace she sought.
Story 4.
I helped my dad and stepmom move into their new home, only to find out they didn't invite me to their housewarming party and lied to everyone about why I wasn't there. Hi, so I ruined my dad's housewarming party a couple of days ago, but with good reason. So hear me out before making any judgments. I, 26 male, lost my mother when I was 5 years old in a freak accident. My dad was single for a really long time and didn't start dating again until I was 13, so he and I were very close for a really long time. And it stayed the same way until he started dating my stepmom, Nora, when I turned 15. They dated for a couple of years before getting married, and I always got this weird feeling that Nora did not really like me, but she always behaved normally around me. So I didn't think much of it since I couldn't exactly start making a fuss about the fact that she did not give me preferential treatment. Anyway, after my dad and Nora got married, we lived together for a very long time until I moved out for college. But when I came back home after graduation to live with my parents until I got a job, things were very different. Nora was very different, and now she openly disliked me. Earlier, I never said anything about these things because I only felt like she did not like me, but when I came back after graduation, she started making it very obvious that she did not approve of me living with them. I tried to talk to my dad about it, but he just told me that she was having a hard time because she had some trouble in her family, and that was it. But I just couldn't shake off the feeling that this was because of me, so I tried to move out as soon as possible, and after that I minimized contact with Nora. Even when I would visit my dad, I would try not to talk to her, so for the past couple of years I've been in touch with my dad but haven't really had much to talk about Nora with, since it's very obvious that she doesn't like me. And last week, my dad called me up and told me that they were moving into a new house since they had ended their lease on the old one and had bought a new place. I was quite surprised because my dad's business had not been doing well for quite a few years now, so I didn't think that he would be able to buy a house. But I was happy for him, so I congratulated him, and I even offered to help him move into his new place. He took me up on that offer, and so I was there with him every step of the way. Now, like any other person, I expected some gratitude for that. But later on, I found out from a couple of relatives that they were throwing a housewarming party, and I was not even invited. When I confronted my dad about it, he told me that the reason he wasn't sure whether he wanted me at the party or not was because of Nora. Unsurprisingly, she believes that this was a fresh start for them as a family, and there was no need for my dad to bring his past mistakes. He told me that these were Nora's words, not his, and he obviously did not agree with them, but he could understand where she was coming from and respected her sentiments. So this was the reason he hadn't invited me, and nor had he invited his ex-in-laws, even though he had been on good terms with all of us. He said that he didn't agree with the fact that I was his mistake, but if he was going to follow what Nora was saying, then it obviously meant that he agreed with her statement, and I was going to take things that way. My dad and I ended up getting into a really bad fight because of that, and I decided that I was going to cut them out of my life because this was really toxic of him. I could not believe that he was taking Nora's side over his own son. When I spoke to my maternal grandparents, even they were very upset because they had always treated my father like their own son after my mother had passed away, and this was not something that they were expecting out of him. They also believed that Nora had changed him, and not in a good way. We don't even know what problem she has with us exactly, but she's pretty stupid because my mother is not even around to compete with her anymore. So she's competing with her family instead. It just goes to show how pathetic she is to be competing for absolutely no reason, since we had always treated her nicely, but she had always had an attitude around us. Anyway, for a couple of days I did not speak to anybody about this, but then my aunt reached out to me to ask why I was not going to be attending my dad's housewarming party. Because she believed that having a business retreat on the same day was not a good enough excuse to miss this event. I had no idea what she was talking about, so I told her that that was not the real reason that I was missing this event. It was because I was not even invited. So then both of us were able to figure out that my dad had been lying to all the guests about why I would not be attending, so they wouldn't ask questions about it later on, and had been telling everyone that I had a business retreat on the same day and I really wanted to go on that trip, which is why I was skipping his housewarming party. I found that very annoying, and I told my aunt the entire truth. I also told her what Nora had said about me being my dad's past mistake and how he had just gone along with her. I was very hurt, so I didn't keep anything to myself and spilled all the details of the drama. She heard me out and she was equally upset and told me that she was going to talk to my dad and fix the situation. But I told her not to bother with it because that would just make it worse. It was then that she told me that she would not speak to my dad, but there was something that I could do to make sure that my dad did not get away with the lies that he had been telling everyone. My aunt told me that apparently my father had been telling everyone that he had bought the house with his own money, but all of us knew that his business had not been doing well, and we had our doubts. My aunt had also had her reservations, so she had talked to my dad about it. My dad had been stupid enough to tell her the truth, that he had actually borrowed a bunch of money from one of his business associates, who had recently inherited a lot of money from a relative. I knew this business associate, let's call him Sam, and he had been working with my father for a really long time. They were also very close friends, and they had a lot of dinners together in the past until Sam moved away. So my dad apparently told Sam that he needed to borrow some money from him because I needed it for my expenses, and my dad's business had not been doing well, so he couldn't help me, but he did not want to let his son down. And that is how he had convinced Sam to lend him the money. But he really intended on using it to buy a new house because he had saved up enough money and he just needed a bit more. He wanted to buy a new house because then he would be able to save money on rent, and whatever money he owed to Sam, he could just pay it whenever he wanted later after his business had taken off, unlike rent, which he would have to pay every month or else he would be evicted. In his head, this was a brilliant idea, and he had told my aunt about it, or rather bragged about it to her, and she had told him that this was terribly dishonest of him, but he did not seem to care about it. He had even been telling everyone that he had finally been able to make it on his own because he was a homeowner, but my aunt knew the truth. And the best part was that he didn't have to tell Sam or invite him to the party because he didn't live here. My aunt told me about all of this, and said that she wasn't putting any ideas in my head, but if I wanted to get back at my father, I knew what to do. I thought about it for a couple of days, but then I decided to call Sam up because I felt quite insulted by the way that my father had treated me. I was very upset, and I couldn't just let this go. So I called Sam, told him everything, and I told him that I needed his help. I wasn't sure if he was going to agree or not, but he agreed to my plan immediately and said that he couldn't even believe that my dad would do such a thing. Apparently, he had been reluctant to help my dad out initially because he had been planning on using his entire inheritance for his kids and wanted to set it all aside for them so he could use his own money for his retirement fund. He also knew that my dad's business was not doing well, so he was not sure how long it would take for my dad to return the money to him. He had been a bit skeptical about lending him money, but my dad had been so insistent and had even become very sentimental while discussing how much he wanted to help me, and yet he wasn't able to. So Sam couldn't decline and ended up giving him the money. And now to find out that all of that had been a lie and an act to get money out of him just so he could buy a new house and then not even invite me to the housewarming party, his son that he supposedly wanted to help, that was just disgusting. The cherry on top was that a couple of friends had told him that my dad had bought a new house, and when he had confronted my father about it, my dad had lied to him and told him that it was from the money that his wife had saved up, and he had apparently not even used a single dollar from what he had borrowed because that was all for me. Sam was furious at being lied to, and I did not need to convince him much to follow my plan. And days back, on the day of the party, I showed up at my father's house with Sam. He was a bit surprised to see us there, but he did not want to create a scene in front of all the guests, so he just pulled us aside and told us to leave before we did anything. He tried to tell us that he would explain all this later, but for now, he just wanted us to leave because he did not want things to go south. But that's not what Sam and I were here for, and we told him that we didn't care, that this was exactly what he deserved. So then we were as loud as we could be before making the announcement that we had come there to make, and announced to everyone that, contrary to what my father had been telling them, he had in fact not been able to save up enough money to buy this house on his own. We told them about what he had said to Sam and how he had borrowed this money from him to help me, and then not even had the decency to invite me after I had helped him move in, just because Nora did not want me around. We exposed all his lies, and his guests were shocked. So once we had done what we had set out to accomplish, Sam and I left and went our separate ways. Since then, the phone calls haven't stopped. My dad keeps trying to call me, and I haven't blocked him yet because I just want the satisfaction of knowing that he is pissed. He kept begging me to apologize to all the guests and tell them that I had been kidding because this was seriously ruining his reputation among his friends and family. But I don't really care about it because it's not like he cared about my feelings, so why should I? And moreover, he has not even apologized to me for the way he had behaved with me. He isn't sorry about what he said about me being a past mistake, and he definitely isn't sorry about lying to Sam about everything. I'm sure that he's in a lot of trouble, but he deserves it, so I don't really feel bad for him. There is someone who does feel bad for him, though, and it's my roommate. My roommate and I have been living together for the past 4 years, and we are very good friends as well, so he obviously knows what is going on in my life. I had told him everything, and after hearing me out, he told me what I had done was completely unnecessary. He thinks that if my father had made it so clear that he did not want to be in my life, then I should have just cut him off and let it be, but playing into his hands, creating more drama, and just being a bad person did not make me any better than him, or even Nora for that matter. I thought that it was a very unfair comparison to make, and I told him that he wouldn't even understand what I was going through since he did not have family issues like mine. We ended up fighting about it, and now for the past couple of days we also haven't been on speaking terms, and I'm seriously questioning if I did the right thing or not because he does have a point. I could have just left it alone. So, AITA for showing up at my dad's housewarming party uninvited and exposing him for all the lies that he had been telling people? Edit. Some people wanted more context about my relationship with Nora, and honestly, I don't know what else to say. We didn't really have much of a relationship. Like I said, I had always maintained that I got a vibe from her in the beginning, but she used to behave normally with me earlier. The reason I got a weird energy from her was because initially she was still quite cold with me, but I tried not to read too much into it because she was a new part of our family. And she was probably just getting used to having a kid around. However, later on when I came back from college, she was openly rude to me, and that's what surprised me. My dad never even had anything to say about it, even though it would take place in front of him. I have no idea about the family issues he was talking about as an excuse for Nora's behavior, because as far as I know, she's pretty content with her family, and they were even there at the housewarming party. My guess is that Nora just started behaving badly with me because she wanted me out of the house, and she had gotten used to not having me around since I was away for college for a couple of years and would only come back for the holidays. So she started behaving rudely to drive me out, and she succeeded because my dad allowed her to succeed. Even after that, I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, but after this, I don't think that's going to work anymore. I honestly have no idea why Nora has a problem with me, because I have never given her any reason to be insecure, yet she somehow is. I don't know how pathetic you have to be for that, but it is what it is. As for my aunt, she and I have always been very close, and I'm not surprised that she chose to tell me about what my father had confided in her regarding the way he got the money for the house. She has always been very righteous, and thankfully, she is nothing like my father. She was pretty much the only maternal figure in my life after my mother passed away. And even though no other relative reached out to me to ask me why I would not be attending the housewarming party, she did. The reason she did not bring up anything about Sam or try to expose my father herself was because if she did, that would create a lot of drama between her and my grandparents, and she did not want that. I think that's fair enough, to be honest. I have never really gotten along with my paternal grandparents anyway, so this doesn't really make much of a difference. Update 1. Hey. So I decided to speak to my roommate since it has been 3 days since I made my post, and even then, we haven't been able to talk to each other. He's a really good friend of mine, and I don't want to lose him over something like this, so I felt like I had to talk to him. I explained how betrayed I felt by my father when he treated me like this, and I did not expect him to understand because he came from a relatively happy family. But for me, it sucks. I thought that he would understand because I was trying to have a heart-to-heart conversation with him, but he told me that I was being petty and my behavior had been very juvenile. According to him, even after I tried to explain myself to the best of my abilities, he did not seem to understand, and the fight just got worse somehow. Eventually, he just told me to my face that he was not interested in being friends with someone like me who was only looking to create drama out of nothing. He told me that if I couldn't even be loyal to my father, then he shouldn't expect any sort of loyalty from me as a friend. I thought it was a ridiculously stupid and asinine thing to say, and I told him that I was going to end the lease on this apartment by the end of the month, and then we would be free to go our separate ways. He had been very sympathetic to me when he had first learned that my father had not invited me to his housewarming party even after I had helped them move in, but suddenly he had pulled a total 180. I feel really bad about it, but I'm not going to tolerate this kind of disrespect, so I have spoken to a couple of other friends, and I have started looking for other apartments nearby. Anyway, I had been planning to move out and live separately by the end of this year, and now it appears that I might do it earlier than expected. So that was whatever happened with my roommate. And the same kind of thing is going on with my family as well. I have not had any contact with my father after that last incident, and the only person who has kept in touch with me from my family is my aunt. Everyone else is not speaking to my dad, but they're not speaking to me either, which doesn't even make sense because it's not like I did anything wrong. My aunt says that it's because of my grandparents, because they think that even if my father made a mistake, I was equally wrong for bringing all of this up in public with Sam just to humiliate my dad. And they have been brainwashing all the other relatives into thinking that I'm just as wrong as my father in this situation. And it was really sad that most of my other relatives have been stupid enough to believe that as well. I don't have anything to say about that, to be honest. I had a good relationship with most of these people in the past, but my childhood is gone now, and I guess the attachment to these people had to leave now. Only my mother's side of the family treats me like one of their own, and I'm happy with that. And of course, my aunt will always have my back. She has also cut her parents off along with my dad because she realized that she really doesn't need their validation anymore. If I can do without it, so can she. I'm content with life right now, if I'm being honest, and I'm honestly much better off without my family. Update 2, hi, so it's been 1 month since I posted here, and I have moved out. I blocked my ex-roommate on every social media platform because I really don't want anything to do with him anymore. The last couple of weeks that we were together before we ended the lease on our apartment were pretty much the worst for me. It was bad enough that we were not talking to each other, but after a while, he even started acting like I was Medusa or something and wouldn't even look at me. And that was really hurtful because we had been friends for a really long time and it felt like he didn't even value that. But it is what it is. I couldn't change that, and so I had to leave. On the day that I left the apartment, he did not even say goodbye to me, and that was when I knew that I had to cut this guy out of my life entirely. It was hard, but I had to do it for my own good, and most of my friends agreed with my decision. So, that was what went on with my roommate, and the same kind of thing is going on with my family as well. I have not had any contact with my father after that last incident, and the only person who has kept in touch with me from my family is my aunt. Everyone else is not speaking to my dad, but they're not speaking to me either, which doesn't even make sense because it's not like I did anything wrong. My aunt says that it's because of my grandparents, because they think that even if my father made a mistake, I was equally wrong for bringing all of this up in public with Sam just to humiliate my dad. And they have been brainwashing all the other relatives into thinking that I'm just as wrong as my father in this situation. And it was really sad that most of my other relatives have been stupid enough to believe that as well. I don't have anything to say about that, to be honest. I had a good relationship with most of these people in the past, but my childhood is gone now, and I guess the attachment to these people had to leave now. Only my mother's side of the family treats me like one of their own, and I'm happy with that. And of course, my aunt will always have my back. She has also cut her parents off along with my dad because she realized that she really doesn't need their validation anymore. If I can do without it, so can she. I'm content with life right now, if I'm being honest, and I'm honestly much better off without my family. Update 3. Hey, it has been 2 weeks since my last update, and the reason I'm back here so soon is because my dad and Nora tried to contact me again a couple of days ago. Both of them texted me to ask if I could meet them, but I just blocked them and ignored it. After I did that, they showed up at my workplace during lunch hours, and I did not want them to embarrass me by throwing a fit in the lobby, so I told the receptionist to have them wait there, and quickly. I took them out of there to a nearby restaurant so I wouldn't have to deal with them around my CO workers. I was obviously very embarrassed already because I had not expected them to show up at my place of work, and I kept berating them because no matter what happened, this was a serious violation of my privacy. And I did not like this at all. At least they had the good sense to apologize for it, but they told me that it was necessary for them to reach out to me. Once we were seated in the restaurant, they told me that they were reaching out to me only because they wanted to apologize, and they realized that they had treated me really badly. Nora confirmed what I already believed about her, that she had always been jealous of the fact that my dad had been so close to me, and it just made her feel like he was still very attached to his late wife, which is why she had tried to ruin our relationship. My dad apologized for getting carried away and acting like a fool. They told me that I did not have to start talking to them, but they just wanted to let me know that they were sorry. So, I told them that I accepted their apologies, but for now, I don't want anything to do with them because I'm finally happy, and I don't want them to ruin it. I thought that they were going to get mad or something, but to my surprise, they were actually cool with it. They told me that I could take my time, and they were fine with that. So we ended the lunch, and they even covered the entire cost of it before leaving. I don't fully trust them yet, and I don't think I ever will. But I'm glad that they apologized and this was resolved. I feel like I got the closure that I needed to completely move on from this. However, that still does not mean that I'm going to forgive them wholeheartedly and get back in touch with them because I really don't want that. Right now. I'm going to take my time, think about it, and maybe a year or two from now I might get back in touch with them if I want to. For now, like I said in my last update, I'm very happy with the life that I'm leading.